The window facing west. My name is Akiko, and I'm a third-year literature student at Waseda University. What I'm about to share happened during the spring semester of 2023, when I was desperately searching for affordable housing in Tokyo. My parents could only afford to send me 8,000 yen a month for rent, which meant I had to look for the cheapest apartments available in the city. The real estate agent, Suzuki-san, showed me several places that were either too far from campus or in terrible condition. Then he mentioned a studio apartment in Shibuya that was surprisingly affordable for the location. When I asked why the rent was so low, he hesitated for a moment before explaining that it was what they call a Jiko Bukin property, an accident property where an unnatural death had occurred. The previous tenant passed away 3 months ago, Suzuki-san said carefully, avoiding eye contact. By law, I'm required to disclose this information. The rent is reduced accordingly. I should have asked more questions, but the apartment was perfect for my budget and only 20 minutes from campus. The studio was on the 5th floor with a small balcony facing west, offering a beautiful view of the Tokyo skyline during sunset. Despite the tragic history, I convinced myself that I could handle living there. After all, I needed somewhere to stay, and my financial situation left me with limited options. I signed the lease that afternoon and moved in the following week. The apartment was clean and newly renovated, with fresh tatami mats and recently painted walls. The only furniture left behind was a small desk positioned near the western window and a traditional Buddhist altar in the corner, which Suzuki-san said the landlord preferred to leave for spiritual protection. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. I established a routine of studying in the late afternoon when the natural light was best, always at that desk by the western window. The sunset view was indeed spectacular, with golden light streaming through the glass and illuminating my textbooks. I felt grateful for finding such a lovely place, despite its unfortunate history. The first unusual incident occurred during my second week there. I was studying for a modern literature exam when I noticed the window sliding open by itself around 6 o'clock in the evening, right as the sun was beginning to set. I assumed it was due to air pressure changes or perhaps the building settling, so I simply closed it and continued reading. But the window kept opening every evening at the same time. Even when I locked it securely, I would hear the familiar sound of the glass sliding in its frame. I mentioned this to my neighbor, Tanaka-san, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for over 10 years. "Ah, the apartment 504, she said with a knowing expression. "The young man who lived there before you, Yamamoto-kun. He was about your age. A university student too, studying economics. Such a quiet, polite boy." I waited for her to continue, but she seemed reluctant to share more details. Finally, she said, he had been struggling with his studies and job hunting. The pressure got to him, I think. One evening in late January, right around sunset, she trailed off, but I understood what she meant. That night, I placed a heavy potted plant in front of the window to prevent it from opening, but I woke up the next morning to find the plant moved aside and the window wide open. The cool morning air had filled the apartment, and I realized I had been sleeping with the balcony door exposed all night. More disturbing than the window opening was what began happening to me during sleep. I started having vivid dreams about standing on the balcony, looking out at the city lights, and feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. In these dreams, someone was always standing beside me, a young man in a university sweater, who would point toward the horizon and whisper about how beautiful everything looked from up there. I would wake up feeling refreshed, but confused, sometimes finding dirt on my bare feet, or discovering that I had moved furniture during the night without any memory of doing so. My study materials would be scattered around the apartment, as if I had been searching for something important while sleepwalking. The sleepwalking episodes became more frequent as the weeks passed. I began setting up barriers around my futon, placing chairs and boxes to prevent myself from wandering during sleep. But these obstacles proved ineffective. I would wake up in the morning to find them carefully moved aside, creating a clear path from my bed to the western window. One particularly frightening morning, I woke up standing on the balcony itself, gripping the railing, and looking out at the sunrise. A neighbor from the building across the street was staring up at me with obvious concern. When I tried to step back inside, I felt a strange resistance, as if something was encouraging me to stay outside and enjoy the view a little longer. That afternoon, I visited a local Buddhist temple near campus and spoke with Hayashi-san, an elderly monk who specialized in spiritual matters related to modern living situations. I explained my situation carefully, mentioning both the apartment's history and my recent sleepwalking episodes. The young man who passed away, Hayashi-san said thoughtfully, he may still be attached to that location, especially if he spent his final moments focused on the western view. Sometimes, when someone dies with strong emotions or unfinished business, their spiritual energy remains concentrated in familiar places. He explained that my sensitivity to spiritual influences was likely heightened by stress, isolation, and the fact that I was sleeping in the same space where Yamamoto-kun had experienced his darkest thought. The western window represented his final focal point, a place where he had stood every evening, perhaps contemplating his future or struggling with despair. The important thing, Hayashi-san continued, is that you're not in any real danger. He's not trying to harm you, but his spiritual presence may be influencing your sleep patterns and drawing you toward behaviors that mirror his own final experiences. Hayashi-san provided me with several protective omamori traditional amulets, specifically blessed for spiritual protection in living spaces. He instructed me to place them at key points around the apartment, above the western window, near my sleeping area, and by the entrance to create a spiritual barrier. He also taught me a simple purification ritual to perform each evening before sunset. I was to light incense at the Buddhist altar, offer prayers for Yamamoto-kun's peaceful rest, and ask respectfully for his understanding that I needed to live safely in the space we now share. The omamori and evening prayers helped significantly, but they didn't completely eliminate the supernatural activity. The window still opened occasionally during sunset, and I sometimes woke up feeling as though I had been having conversations with someone during the night. However, the intense sleepwalking episodes stopped, and I no longer found myself standing dangerously close to the balcony railing. I developed a new routine that acknowledged both my practical needs and the spiritual presence in the apartment. Each evening, I would perform the purification ritual, then move away from the western window during sunset hours, studying instead at a small table I placed on the opposite side of the room. I learned to coexist with the occasional supernatural disturbances while maintaining my safety and sanity. During my final month in that apartment, I had what I believe was a direct encounter with Yamamoto-kun's spirit. I was studying late one evening when I noticed a reflection in the dark window, not my own, but that of a young man sitting at the desk where I usually worked during the day. He appeared to be writing furiously, as if trying to complete an important assignment. Instead of feeling frightened, I felt a profound sadness for this person who seemed trapped in an endless cycle of academic pressure and worry. I said aloud, "Yamamoto-kun, you don't have to keep studying. You can rest now." The reflection paused, looked directly at me with gratitude in his eyes, and slowly faded away. After that night, the supernatural activity decreased dramatically. The window still opened occasionally, but it felt less urgent, more like a gentle reminder of someone's presence rather than a desperate call for attention. When I moved out at the end of the semester to share an apartment with friends, I left the protective omamori in place for the next tenant. I also wrote a letter explaining the apartment's history and the spiritual practices that had helped me coexist peacefully with its previous occupant. Looking back, I realize that experience taught me something important about the intersection of traditional spiritual beliefs and modern urban life in Japan. Sometimes, we share our living spaces not only with our neighbors, but with the emotional energy of those who came before us. The key is learning to acknowledge that presence with respect, while maintaining appropriate boundaries for our own well-being. I still think about Yamamoto-kun sometimes, especially during beautiful sunsets. I hope that wherever his spirit has gone, he's found the peace that eluded him during his final months in that western-facing apartment. And I'm grateful for the lesson he taught me about the importance of asking for help before despair becomes overwhelming. That apartment in Shibuya was my first real introduction to the complex spiritual landscape of Tokyo living, where ancient beliefs adapt to modern circumstances, and where economic necessity sometimes leads us into situations that challenge our understanding of the world around us. Room 201's helper. My name is Maria Santos, and I came to Japan from the Philippines in 2022 to work as a live-in domestic helper. What I'm about to share happened during my assignment caring for Yamamoto-san, an 84-year-old gentleman who lived alone in a Shinjuku apartment building. The agency that placed me had mentioned that the previous helper had left suddenly, but they assured me it was due to a family emergency back home, not any problems with the client or living situation. Yamamoto-san lived in apartment 202, a modest two-bedroom unit on the second floor of a residential building that had been constructed in the 1980s. The apartment was clean and well-maintained, with traditional Japanese elements like tatami mats in the main room and a small Buddhist altar near the entrance. My employer was a retired postal worker who had lived there for over 20 years, and he seemed genuinely grateful to have help with daily tasks like cooking, cleaning, and managing his medications. The arrangement was typical for domestic helpers in Japan. I had my own small room adjacent to the kitchen, shared the main living spaces, and was available around the clock for any assistance Yamamoto-san might need. The pay was fair, and my employer was respectful and kind, always using polite language and showing appreciation for my work. I felt fortunate to have found such a comfortable placement. During my first week, I focused on learning Yamamoto-san's routines and preferences. He was an early riser who enjoyed watching the morning news while I prepared his breakfast, and he spent most afternoons reading or listening to classical music. He moved slowly, but was still relatively independent, only needing assistance with tasks that required reaching high shelves or carrying heavy items. The first unusual thing I noticed was how thin the walls were between apartments. I could clearly hear conversations, television programs, and daily activities from the neighboring units. The apartment directly adjacent to ours, number 201, seemed particularly quiet during the day, but I assumed the residents worked regular hours and were simply away during the times I was most active around the apartment. It was during my second week that I first heard the distinctive sound that would soon dominate my nights. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by the unmistakable whirring of an electric wheelchair motor coming through the shared wall between our apartment and Unit 201. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone was moving methodically around their living space, pausing at specific locations before continuing to the next spot. At first, I assumed it was simply a neighbor with mobility issues who had difficulty sleeping and was moving around during the quiet nighttime hours. Many elderly people have disrupted sleep patterns, and I didn't think much of it beyond noting that the walls were thinner than I had initially realized. But the pattern was remarkably consistent. Every single night, at exactly 2 a.m., the wheelchair sounds would begin, lasting for approximately 30 to 40 minutes before stopping abruptly. The route seemed to follow the same path each time, starting from what I assumed was the bedroom area, moving through the main living space, pausing near what would be the kitchen, then returning to the starting point. After a week of these nightly disturbances, I mentioned the situation to Yamamoto-san during breakfast, asking if he knew anything about our neighbor's schedule or condition. that might explain the regular nighttime activity. Yamamoto-san paused with his chopsticks halfway to his mouth, a troubled expression crossing his face. Apartment 201? He repeated slowly. Maria-san, that apartment has been empty for several months now. The previous tenant, Kobayashi-san, passed away last winter. I felt a chill run through me, but I tried to maintain my composure. Perhaps someone new has moved in recently? I suggested. The real estate market is always active in this area. No, Yamamoto-san said firmly, shaking his head. I would have noticed new neighbors. The building manager, Sato-san, mentioned that the apartment remains difficult to rent because of the circumstances surrounding Kobayashi-san's death. It was very tragic. He seemed reluctant to share more details, but I gently pressed him for information, explaining that I was concerned about the nightly sounds and wanted to understand the situation better. Finally, Yamamoto-san told me what he knew about our former neighbor. Kobayashi-san had been a man in his 70s who lived alone after his wife's death several years earlier. A stroke had left him partially paralyzed and dependent on an electric wheelchair for mobility. According to Yamamoto-san, Kobayashi-san had become increasingly isolated and depressed, especially during the winter months when he rarely left his apartment. He was a proud man, Yamamoto-san explained sadly. Before his stroke, he had been very active and independent. The wheelchair represented everything he had lost, but he couldn't function without it. I think the dependency became too much for him to bear. In January of that year, building residents had noticed that they hadn't seen Kobayashi-san for several days. When the building manager checked his apartment, they found that he had taken his own life. The tragic detail that haunted me was that he had died while sitting in his electric wheelchair, apparently unable to imagine existing separately from the mobility device that had become both his lifeline and his prison. That night, I lay awake listening more carefully to the sounds from apartment 201. Now that I knew the history, the wheelchair movements took on a more disturbing quality. The pattern seemed less random and more purposeful, as if someone was following a familiar routine that they had performed countless times while alive. I could hear the distinctive pause near what would be the kitchen area, lasting exactly long enough for someone to prepare a simple meal or take medication. There was another pause near the balcony door, where perhaps Kobayashi-san had enjoyed looking out at the city lights during his long, solitary evenings. Most unsettling was the way the sounds would stop abruptly after the same duration each night, as if the routine had reached its natural conclusion or the person performing it had simply vanished. I considered mentioning this to Yamamoto-san, but I was concerned about frightening him or seeming unprofessional. As a domestic helper, I was expected to maintain a calm, capable presence in the household, and I didn't want my employer to think I was unreliable or overly superstitious. Instead, I decided to speak with Sato-san, the building manager, about the situation. I found him in the building's small office on the ground floor and carefully explained what I had been hearing each night, emphasizing that I was simply concerned about building security and whether someone might have unauthorized access to the vacant apartment. Sato-san's reaction confirmed my growing suspicions that this was not a normal situation. His face grew pale as I described the timing and nature of the sounds, and he immediately shook his head. "That's impossible," he said firmly. "I have the only key to apartment 201, and I check it regularly. The electricity has been disconnected since February, so even if someone had gained access, there would be no power for an electric wheelchair or any other devices." He offered to show me the apartment to prove that it was indeed vacant, and I accepted his invitation, hoping that seeing the empty space would somehow explain the mysterious sounds I had been hearing. When Sato-san unlocked the door to apartment 201, I was struck by how different it felt from Yamamoto-san's warm, lived-in space next door. The apartment was completely empty, with no furniture, appliances, or personal belongings. The tatami mats showed faint impressions, where heavy furniture had once sat, and there was a lingering smell of cleaning chemicals mixed with something else I couldn't identify. "As you can see," Sato-san said, gesturing around the bare rooms, "there's nothing here that could possibly make the sounds you've described. We removed all of Kobayashi-san's belongings months ago, including his wheelchair. But standing in that empty apartment, I could envision exactly where the nighttime sounds originated. The bedroom area where the wheelchair journey began each night, the path through the main living space, the pause near the kitchen counter, and the stop by the balcony door where Kobayashi-san might have spent his final moments contemplating his decision. That evening, I decided to seek guidance from someone with experience in spiritual matters. Through the Filipino community network in Tokyo, I was connected with Mrs. Cruz, an older woman who had worked as a domestic helper in Japan for over 15 years and was known for her knowledge of both Filipino and Japanese spiritual traditions. Mrs. Cruz listened carefully as I described my situation, nodding knowingly when I mentioned the consistent timing and repetitive nature of the supernatural manifestations. "What you're experiencing is very common in Japanese housing," she explained, "especially in cases where someone died while strongly attached to their daily routines or possessions." The wheelchair wasn't just a tool for Kobayashi-san, it was his connection to independence and dignity. His spirit may still be performing the same activities that gave structure to his final months. She explained that as a domestic helper, I was particularly susceptible to spiritual influences because of my role as a caregiver and my sensitivity to the emotional atmosphere of the homes where I worked. The fact that I was living alone, in an apartment adjacent to where the tragedy occurred, made the spiritual connection even stronger. Mrs. Cruz provided me with several practical suggestions for managing the situation. She gave me a small bottle of blessed water from a Filipino Catholic church and instructed me to sprinkle it along the shared wall each evening before bed, while saying a prayer for Kobayashi-san's peaceful rest. She also taught me a respectful way to acknowledge his presence without encouraging continued manifestations. Each night, at around 1:30 a.m., I was to speak quietly toward the shared wall, saying something like, "Kobayashi-san, please rest peacefully. Your suffering is over now, and you don't need to continue your earthly routines." Additionally, Mrs. Cruz suggested that I light a small candle each evening and offer prayers for both Kobayashi-san's spirit and my own protection while living in such close proximity to his former home. These spiritual practices helped significantly, though they didn't completely eliminate the wheelchair sounds. What changed was my relationship to the phenomenon. Instead of feeling frightened or disturbed by the nightly activity, I began to perceive it as a sign of Kobayashi-san's struggle to let go of the routines that had defined his final months. Sometimes, when the sounds seemed particularly agitated or prolonged, I would softly speak words of comfort toward the wall, assuring Kobayashi-san that he didn't need to continue pushing himself through the same difficult motions that had once been necessary for his survival. Gradually, the manifestations became less intense and less frequent. Instead of every single night, the wheelchair sounds occurred perhaps 3 or 4 times per week, and the duration shortened from 40 minutes to 15 or 20 minutes. I also noticed that the sounds began to change character slightly. Instead of the mechanical, repetitive quality they had initially possessed, they sometimes seemed more peaceful, as if Kobayashi-san was slowly learning to move through his spiritual routines with less anxiety and desperation. During my final month caring for Yamamoto-san, I had what I believe was a direct encounter with Kobayashi-san's spirit. I was awakened not by wheelchair sounds, but by a gentle tapping on the shared wall. When I listened carefully, I could hear what sounded like someone trying to communicate through the wall using a simple knocking pattern. Instead of feeling frightened, I felt moved to respond. I tapped back gently, creating a simple rhythm that he repeated. We continued this quiet conversation for several minutes, and I had the distinct impression that Kobayashi-san was expressing gratitude for my respectful acknowledgement of his presence, and my prayers for his peaceful rest. After that night, the wheelchair sounds stopped completely. The apartment next door returned to the deep silence that had initially seemed so unusual during my first week of residence. When I eventually moved on to a new position caring for a different family, I made sure to leave detailed instructions for the next domestic helper about the building's spiritual situation and the protective practices that had proven effective. I also left some blessed water and candles with specific instructions about showing respect for Kobayashi-san's memory. Looking back on my time in that Shinjuku apartment, I realize it taught me important lessons about the spiritual dimensions of caregiving work in Japan. As domestic helpers, we often find ourselves living intimately with the emotional residue of family tragedies, failed dreams, and unresolved grief. The key to managing these situations is approaching them with the same compassion and respect we show our living clients. Kobayashi-san's spirit wasn't trying to frighten anyone. He was simply trapped in the routines that had once provided structure and meaning during his most difficult period. By acknowledging his struggle with dignity and offering spiritual support for his transition, I was able to transform a frightening situation into an opportunity for healing, both for his restless spirit and for my own understanding of the invisible connections that bind us to the places where we live and work. Even now, in my current position, I maintain the evening prayers that Mrs. Cruz taught me, not only for my own protection, but as a way of honoring all the souls who have struggled with loneliness, disability, and despair in the countless apartments where domestic helpers like myself provide care and companionship to Japan's aging population. The commuter's last stop. My name is Hiroshi Tanaka, and I work as a systems analyst for a mid-sized IT company in Shinjuku. What I'm about to share happened during the autumn of 2023, when I was working excessive overtime hours and regularly taking the last train home to my apartment in Nippori. The incident I experienced on the Yamanote line has fundamentally changed how I view the boundaries between the living and the dead, especially in the cramped, anonymous spaces of Tokyo's train system. My daily routine had become depressingly predictable due to the crushing workload at my company. I would arrive at the office by 8:30 in the morning and rarely leave before 11 p.m., sometimes staying until nearly midnight to meet impossible project deadlines. The last Yamanote line train, departing Ikebukuro Station at 11:47 p.m., had become my lifeline home, often carrying exhausted salarymen like myself who had no choice but to sacrifice personal time for corporate survival. The Yamanote line is Tokyo's busiest circular route, connecting all major districts and running trains every few minutes during peak hours. But the late-night services carry a different atmosphere, entirely quieter, more somber, filled with people whose faces reflect the weight of another day spent meeting other people's expectations. During those late rides, passengers rarely make eye contact or engage in conversation, preferring to lose themselves in their phones or simply stare blankly out the windows at the city lights rushing past. It was during my third week of taking the 11:47 train that I first noticed her. A woman in her late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a standard office uniform, consisting of a dark blue blazer, white blouse, and knee-length skirt. What immediately struck me as unusual was that her clothes appeared to be stained with something dark and wet, creating irregular patches across the front of her blazer and blouse that looked disturbingly like blood. She would board at Ikebukuro Station, always entering through the same door of the same car, and always taking the same seat near the window on the left side of the train. Her behavior was remarkably consistent. She would sit perfectly still, staring straight ahead with her hands folded neatly in her lap, never looking around or acknowledging other passengers. At first, I assumed she was simply another overworked office employee like myself, perhaps dealing with a nosebleed or some other minor medical issue that had stained her clothing. Tokyo's work culture is notoriously demanding, and it's not uncommon to see people pushing themselves to the point of physical exhaustion or stress-related health problems. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice details that didn't make sense. Her clothing was always stained in exactly the same pattern, as if the dark patches never dried or changed position. She never carried a purse, briefcase, or any of the usual accessories that office workers typically have with them during commute hours. Most unnervingly, she never seemed to get off the train at any station. She would simply be there when I boarded at Ikebukuro, and I would lose track of her at some point during the journey to Nippori. My curiosity about this mysterious woman coincided with a particularly stressful period at work. Our department was facing a major system migration deadline, and I was averaging only 4 hours of sleep per night while working on complex database configurations that seemed to resist every solution I attempted. The chronic exhaustion and pressure were affecting my judgment and making me more susceptible to obsessive thoughts about things I couldn't understand or control. One evening in late October, I decided to pay closer attention to the woman's behavior throughout the entire train journey. I positioned myself in a seat with a clear view of her location and watched carefully as the train made its way around the Yamanote line loop. She remained completely motionless for the entire 40-minute ride, never shifting position, never blinking, never showing any of the small unconscious movements that living people make, even when trying to sit still. When the train reached Nippori Station and I prepared to disembark, I glanced back at her seat one final time. She was gone. Not walking toward the doors, not gathering belongings, simply absent, as if she had never been there at all. The seat she had occupied showed no impression, no warmth, no evidence that anyone had been sitting there during the journey. That night, I couldn't sleep despite my exhaustion. I kept thinking about the woman's unnaturally still posture and the way she seemed to exist in a space separate from the normal flow of train passenger activity. The next day at work, I found myself distracted and unable to concentrate on my programming tasks, my mind returning repeatedly to questions about what I had witnessed. During my lunch break, I decided to research recent incidents on the Yamanote line, searching online news archives for any accidents or unusual occurrences that might explain the woman's disturbing appearance. What I discovered made my blood run cold. In November of the previous year, a 28-year-old office worker named Suzuki Yuki had committed suicide by jumping in front of the 11:47 p.m. Yamanote line train at Ikebukuro Station. According to the news reports, she had been struggling with severe workplace harassment and had recently been denied a promotion despite working unpaid overtime for months. The incident had caused significant delays on the line and had traumatized both the train operator and passengers who witnessed the tragedy. The details that chilled me most were the descriptions of what Suzuki-san had been wearing when she died: a dark blue office blazer, white blouse, and knee-length skirt, exactly matching the outfit worn by the mysterious woman I had been seeing on the train. The news articles mentioned that she had worked for a marketing company in Shinjuku and had been taking the late train home to her apartment in the northern part of Tokyo. Armed with this information, I began to understand that I was likely encountering the spirit of Suzuki Yuki, somehow bound to the train route where she had ended her life. The bloodstains on her clothing probably represented the traumatic injuries she had sustained, and her repetitive behavior suggested that she was trapped in a cycle of riding the same train she had used during her final weeks of life. Traditional Japanese beliefs hold that people who die with strong negative emotions or unfinished business can become earthbound spirits, particularly if their death occurred in a place associated with routine activities or unfulfilled obligations. For a young office worker who had been struggling with workplace stress and social isolation, the train that carried her between work and home would represent both her daily suffering and her desperate search for escape. Despite my growing certainty about the supernatural nature of my encounters with this woman, I felt compelled to continue observing her. Perhaps it was my own stress and loneliness that made me feel connected to her story. Or perhaps I hoped that somehow acknowledging her presence might provide some comfort to her restless spirit. For several more weeks, I continued taking the 11:47 train and watching Suzuki-san's spirit repeat her nightly journey. I began to feel a strange sense of companionship with her, as if we were both trapped in cycles of endless work and commuting that had drained the life from our existence even before death had claimed her. The decisive encounter occurred on a particularly cold November evening when I had worked until nearly midnight and barely caught the last train. The car was almost empty except for myself, an elderly man sleeping near the door, and Suzuki-san in her usual seat. The exhaustion and isolation of my own life suddenly felt overwhelming, and I found myself walking over to sit in the seat directly across from her. For the first time since I had begun noticing her, I spoke directly to her presence. "Suzuki-san," I said quietly, using the polite honorific despite not knowing if she could hear me. "I know what happened to you. I understand how difficult things must have been." For several minutes, she remained motionless, staring straight ahead as always. Then, slowly, she turned her head to look directly at me. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Her face was partially crushed on the left side, with dark blood covering her cheek and temple. Her left eye socket was damaged, and there was a deep indentation where her skull had been fractured. But her right eye was intact and focused on me with an expression of profound sadness and gratitude. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but I heard every word clearly despite the noise of the train moving along the tracks. "Nippori," she said, naming my destination station. "You get off at Nippori." I had never told anyone on that train where I lived or where I was going. She had somehow perceived this information through our shared experience of late-night commuting and workplace exhaustion. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling. "That's my stop." She continued looking at a small gesture that might have been a wave or a blessing. As the train doors opened and I stepped onto the platform, I turned for one final glimpse through the window. Her seat was empty, and this time I somehow knew that she would not be returning to ride the 11:47 train again. In the weeks that followed, I continued taking the late train home, but Suzuki-san never reappeared. The car felt different, without her presence emptier, in a way that had nothing to do with the number of passengers. I realized that her spirit had somehow found the peace or resolution needed to move beyond the cycle of endless commuting that had trapped her after death. This experience fundamentally changed my relationship with my work and my daily routine. I began leaving the office earlier, whenever possible, refusing to accept that my entire life should be consumed by corporate obligations that would ultimately leave me as isolated and desperate as Suzuki-san had been during her final months. I also started paying more attention to my fellow late-night commuters, recognizing that each person on those trains was dealing with their own struggles and pressures that might not be visible to casual observers. The anonymous nature of Tokyo train travel can make us forget that we're surrounded by people who share similar challenges and fears. Sometimes, during my evening commute, I offer a silent prayer for Suzuki-san's peaceful rest, and for all the other overworked souls who find themselves trapped in cycles of exhaustion and despair that seem impossible to escape. I hope that by acknowledging their suffering and treating their stories with respect, we can somehow ease the burden they carry, whether in life or in whatever form of existence follows death. The 11:47 train continues to run its route around the Yamanote line, carrying tired workers home to brief respites before another day of corporate obligations begins. But now I understand that some passengers may be traveling routes that extend far beyond the physical boundaries of Tokyo's rail system, searching for destinations that can only be reached through compassion, acknowledgement, and the simple human recognition that their struggles matter. That recognition, I learned, can sometimes provide the spiritual resolution needed to finally reach the last stop on a journey that had seemed destined to continue forever. The Inheritance. My name is Kenji Watanabe, and I'm a recent graduate from Meiji University with a degree in business administration. What I'm about to share happened during the summer of 2023, when I moved into my late grandmother's apartment in Asakusa to save money while job hunting. The discovery I made about my grandmother's final years has completely changed how I understand both her life and the invisible connections that bind us to the places where we live. My grandmother, Watanabe Sachiko, had lived alone in the same two-bedroom apartment for over 30 years, ever since my grandfather passed away in the early 1990s. She was a quiet, reserved woman who rarely spoke about her daily life, and our family had always assumed her solitary existence was simply her way of coping with widowhood. When she died peacefully in her sleep at age 87, she left the apartment to me in her will, along with a small inheritance that would help cover my living expenses during my transition from university to full-time employment. The apartment was located on the third floor of a modest residential building constructed in the 1970s in a quiet neighborhood known for its traditional atmosphere and proximity to Sensoji Temple. The rent was reasonable even by Tokyo standards, and inheriting the lease would save me thousands of yen per month, compared to finding my own place in the competitive rental market. My parents, who lived in Saitama, were supportive of my decision to move into grandmother's apartment, though my mother expressed some concerns about me living alone in a place with so many memories of family loss. My father, ever practical, pointed out that the financial savings would allow me to be more selective about job opportunities rather than accepting the first position offered simply to pay rent. The apartment itself was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits, modest but well-maintained, with traditional tatami mats in the main room, a small kitchen equipped with appliances from the 1980s, and a balcony overlooking the narrow street below. Grandmother had kept the space meticulously clean, and most of her personal belongings were simple, practical items that reflected a life of careful frugality. What struck me most during my first week of residence was how thoroughly grandmother had prepared the apartment for my inheritance. She had labeled important items, organized documents in clearly marked folders, and even left detailed instructions about the building's quirks, such as which elevator buttons stuck and how to adjust the temperamental water heater. Among her papers, I found a folder labeled Building Information that contained maintenance records, contact numbers for utilities, and what appeared to be a detailed history of the other tenants who had lived in the building over the years. Her handwriting filled several notebooks with observations about neighbors' routines, family changes, and various incidents that had occurred in the building during her decades of residence. It was while reading these notebooks that I first learned about the tragedy that had occurred in apartment 201, directly below grandmother's unit. According to her careful records, a family of 3 had lived there during the late 1990s. A father who worked as a taxi driver, his wife who stayed home with their young daughter, and the little girl who had been around 6 years old. Grandmother's notes became increasingly detailed and concerned as she documented what appeared to be escalating domestic violence in the apartment below. She wrote about hearing arguments, crying, and furniture being thrown, always followed by periods of tense silence that seemed more ominous than the outbursts themselves. The final entry in this section of her notebooks was dated December 15, 1998. In her precise handwriting, she had recorded, "Terrible sounds from below last night. Police and ambulances this morning. The Ishida family is gone. Building manager says we must not speak of what happened." I spent that evening researching online archives of local news from late 1998 and eventually found a brief article about a murder-suicide in Asakusa. Ishida Tetsuya, 34, had killed his wife and daughter before taking his own life in their apartment. The article mentioned financial stress and suspected mental illness as contributing factors, but provided few details about the specific circumstances. Understanding this history helped explain some of the building's characteristics that I had noticed during my first week of residence. Apartment 201 had remained vacant for as long as I could remember, and the building manager, Ogawa-san, had mentioned that the rent for that unit was significantly reduced due to its classification as jikobuken, an accident property where unnatural deaths had occurred. What I couldn't understand was why grandmother had continued living directly above such a tragic location for over 20 years, especially when she could have afforded to move to a different apartment. Her financial situation had been stable, and she had no particular attachment to the neighborhood that would have prevented her from seeking housing elsewhere. The answer to this question began to emerge during my second week in the apartment, when I started noticing sounds coming from the supposedly vacant unit below. At first, these seemed like typical building noises, pipes settling, air conditioning units cycling on and off, or perhaps maintenance workers conducting periodic inspections of the empty apartment. But the sounds followed patterns that were too regular and too human to be explained by mechanical systems or routine maintenance. Every evening around 8 o'clock, I would hear what sounded like footsteps moving through the apartment below, followed by the distinctive creaking of furniture and the soft murmur of conversation. Initially, I assumed that Ogawa-san had rented the apartment to new tenants without mentioning it to me. But when I asked him about this during a chance encounter in the building lobby, he seemed genuinely puzzled by my question. Apartment 201 has been empty since I became building manager 12 years ago, he said firmly. The previous manager told me it was too difficult to rent because of its history, and the reduced rent doesn't cover the costs of frequent tenant turnover when people learn about what happened there. That evening, I decided to listen more carefully to the sounds from below. What I heard made my blood run cold and fundamentally changed my understanding of my grandmother's final decades. The conversation I heard through the floor was not between strangers or new tenants. It was my grandmother's voice, speaking in the gentle, patient tone she had always used when talking to children or people in distress. She was talking to someone, multiple people. It seemed in a conversation that sounded both one-sided and interactive, as if she were responding to replies that I couldn't hear. Yes, I know it's difficult, I heard her say clearly through the thin floor. But you must try to rest peacefully. The anger will only make things harder for everyone. There was a pause, during which I could hear faint sounds that might have been responses from other voices, though these were too muffled for me to understand clearly. The little one is fine, grandmother continued. She doesn't need to be frightened anymore. There's no more shouting, no more pain, just peace now. I sat on the floor of grandmother's, now my living room, pressing my ear to the tatami mats and listening in amazement as this conversation continued for nearly an hour. My grandmother's voice was exactly as I remembered it from life, patient and comforting, addressing what seemed to be the concerns and anxieties of the Ishida family, who had died in the apartment below over 20 years earlier. As the weeks passed, these nightly conversations became a regular part of my routine. Every evening around 8 o'clock, I would hear grandmother's voice speaking through the floor to the departed family, offering comfort, guidance, and companionship to spirits who seemed unable to find peace after their violent deaths. The content of these conversations gradually revealed the extent of my grandmother's relationship with the Ishida family's spirits. She had apparently been serving as a mediator and source of comfort for them since shortly after their deaths, helping them process their trauma and maintain some semblance of family connection despite the circumstances that had ended their lives. Tetsuya-san, you must forgive yourself. I heard her say one evening, what happened was not entirely your fault. The sickness in your mind, the pressure you felt, These things were real burdens that you carried alone for too long. Another night, she addressed the mother and daughter directly. Yuki-chan, your papa loves you very much. He never wanted to hurt you or Oka-san. Sometimes grown-ups make terrible mistakes when they're very sick and scared. But that doesn't mean they stop loving their families. Through these overheard conversations, I began to understand that my grandmother had dedicated her final years to providing spiritual care for a family trapped in their apartment by the traumatic circumstances of their deaths. Her isolation, which our family had interpreted as depression or antisocial behavior, had actually been a form of compassionate service to souls who desperately needed guidance and comfort. The conversations also revealed details about traditional Japanese spiritual beliefs that I had never fully understood. Grandmother spoke knowledgeably about Buddhist concepts of karma, attachment, and the importance of releasing anger and resentment in order to achieve peaceful transition to whatever comes after death. Remember what the monk at Sensoji taught us, she would say. Holding on to pain and anger only creates more suffering. You must let go of what happened and focus on the love you still have for each other. After a month of listening to these nightly sessions, I decided to seek guidance from Hayashi-san, an elderly Buddhist monk at Sensoji Temple, who was known for his knowledge of spiritual matters affecting local residents. I carefully explained what I had been experiencing, emphasizing that I was not frightened, but rather curious about how to appropriately honor my grandmother's work. Hayashi-san listened thoughtfully before explaining that what I was witnessing was a form of spiritual mediation that some particularly compassionate individuals undertake when they encounter earthbound spirits in need of guidance. Your grandmother possessed what we call jihi no kokoro, a heart of compassion that recognized the suffering of others and compelled her to offer assistance, he said. The Ishida family's spirits were trapped by the violence and despair of their final moments, unable to release their earthly attachments and move toward peaceful rest. He explained that grandmother's nightly conversations had likely been providing the emotional and spiritual support needed to help the family work through their trauma and eventually find peace. This type of work required enormous patience and spiritual strength, as it meant taking on the emotional burden of others' suffering, night after night, for years or even decades. The question now, Hayashi-san continued, is whether you feel called to continue this work, or whether it's time to help the Ishida family find final resolution, so that both they and your grandmother's spirit can rest. I spent several sleepless nights considering this question. The conversations between my grandmother and the Ishida family had become strangely comforting to me, a connection to grandmother's memory and a reminder of her extraordinary compassion. But I also wondered whether continuing to enable these interactions might be preventing the spirits from moving toward the resolution they ultimately needed. During my final week in the apartment before starting a new job that would require me to relocate, I decided to participate directly in the nightly conversations. That evening, when grandmother's voice began speaking through the floor, I knelt on the tatami mats and added my own words to the discussion. Grandmother, I said aloud, addressing the empty apartment below, I understand now what you've been doing all these years. I'm grateful for your compassion and your dedication to helping the Ishida family. The response was immediate and unmistakable. I heard my grandmother's voice, clear and warm, speaking directly to me for the first time since her death. Kenji-kun, she said, using the affectionate diminutive she had always used when I was young. You've grown into such a thoughtful young man. I'm proud of the person you've become. Tears filled my eyes as I continued the conversation. Grandmother, have you been helping them all this time? Is that why you never moved to a different apartment? They needed someone to listen, she replied simply. Tetsuya-san, Michiko-san, and little Yuki-chan were trapped by their pain and fear. I couldn't abandon them to suffer alone in the darkness. During that final conversation, I sensed that my presence and acknowledgement had provided something that had been missing from grandmother's solitary work with the Ishida family. With a living family member aware of and supportive of her spiritual service, she was finally able to complete the process of helping them find peace. It's time for all of us to rest now. I heard her say to the spirits below, Kenji-kun understands what we've accomplished together, and he will remember our work with respect and gratitude. You can let go of your worries now. The next morning, the apartment below was completely silent for the first time since I had moved in. The oppressive sense of unfinished business that had hung over the building for decades had lifted, replaced by a feeling of completion and peaceful resolution. When I moved out of grandmother's apartment the following week, I left detailed notes for the next tenant about the building's history and the spiritual work that had taken place there. I also made arrangements with Hayashi-san to have periodic blessing ceremonies performed for both apartments, ensuring that the peace my grandmother had helped establish would be maintained. Looking back on my brief residence in that Asakusa apartment, I realize it taught me profound lessons about compassion, duty, and the invisible ways that love extends beyond death. My grandmother's apparent isolation had actually been a form of spiritual service that required tremendous strength and dedication. The experience also deepened my understanding of traditional Japanese beliefs about the interconnectedness of the brute, living and the dead, and the responsibility that some individuals feel to assist souls who cannot find peace on their own. My grandmother's nightly conversations with the Ishida family represented a form of spiritual caregiving that bridges the gap between traditional religious practices and the practical needs of modern urban life. Even now, years later, I maintain a small Buddhist altar in my current apartment, where I offer prayers for my grandmother's peaceful rest and for the Ishida family's successful transition to whatever comes after death. I also make regular donations to temples that provide spiritual counseling services, understanding now how crucial this work can be for both the living and the dead. The apartment building in Asakusa continues to house families and individuals seeking affordable housing in one of Tokyo's most traditional neighborhoods. But I will always know that it also served as a place where extraordinary compassion transcended the boundaries between life and death, providing comfort and healing to souls who had nowhere else to turn for help. The night shift. My name is Yuki Nakamura, and I'm a 23-year-old part-time worker who took a graveyard shift position at a Family Mart convenience store in Edogawa Ward during the winter of 2023. What I experienced during those long, isolated nights has fundamentally changed my understanding of how the past continues to influence the present, especially in Tokyo, where new buildings constantly replace old ones without erasing the memories held by the land beneath them. I had been struggling to find stable employment after graduating from a 2-year vocational program in business administration. The job market was competitive, and most positions required experience I didn't have, or offered hours that conflicted with my need to care for my elderly mother during the day. When I saw the posting for overnight convenience store work, it seemed like the perfect solution. The pay was decent, the hours would allow me to help with my mother's daily needs, and night shift workers typically received additional compensation for working during antisocial hours. The Family Mart where I was hired was relatively new, having opened just 2 years earlier in a location that had previously been vacant for several years. The store manager, Sasaki-san, was a middle-aged man who seemed relieved to find someone willing to work the overnight shift, which ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. and required me to handle everything from restocking shelves to serving the occasional late-night customer. During my training shifts, Sasaki-san mentioned that the store had experienced some difficulty keeping overnight staff, with several previous employees quitting after only a few weeks without providing clear explanations for their departure. He attributed this to the isolation and boredom of working alone during the quiet hours when foot traffic was minimal and the main tasks involved cleaning, inventory management, and staying alert for potential security issues. The store itself was typical of modern Family Mart locations, brightly lit, efficiently organized, and equipped with all the standard convenience store amenities, including hot food dispensers, coffee machines, and an extensive selection of ready-made meals and snacks. The layout was straightforward, with large windows facing the street that provided clear visibility in all directions and created an open, secure feeling even during the darkest hours of night. For my first 2 weeks on the job, everything proceeded normally. The overnight hours were indeed quiet, with only a handful of customers during each shift, usually taxi drivers grabbing coffee, late shift workers picking up meals, or occasional insomniacs buying cigarettes or magazines. I used the slow periods to study for certification exams that might improve my job prospects, finding the well-lit environment and steady background hum of refrigeration units conducive to concentration. The first unusual incident occurred during my 3rd week, around 3:30 in the morning on a particularly cold February night. I was restocking the beverage coolers when I noticed a strong smell of gas that seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the store. My immediate concern was a potential leak from the kitchen equipment or heating system, so I carefully checked all the gas-powered appliances and ventilation systems, but found nothing unusual. The smell persisted for about 20 minutes before gradually fading away, leaving me puzzled but not particularly alarmed. I made a note to mention it to Sasaki-san during the shift change, thinking it might be worth having a maintenance technician inspect the gas lines as a precautionary measure. The next night, the same thing happened at almost exactly the same time. The strong odor of gas filled the store around 3:30 a.m., lasted for approximately 20 minutes, then disappeared completely. This time, I was more systematic in my investigation, checking not only the store's equipment, but also opening doors and windows to determine if the smell might be coming from outside the building. When I mentioned this pattern to Sasaki-san, his reaction was more concerned than I had expected. He immediately arranged for a certified gas technician to inspect all the store's systems, but the inspection revealed no leaks, faulty connections, or other problems that could account for the mysterious odor. The previous night shift worker mentioned something similar. Sasaki-san admitted reluctantly, but the gas company has checked our systems 3 times in the past year, and they've never found anything wrong. During my 4th week, the gas smell began to be accompanied by other disturbing phenomena. Around 3:15 a.m., I started noticing small handprints appearing on the inside surface of the store's large front windows. These prints were about the size a child would make, and they appeared gradually, as if invisible hands were pressing against the glass from within the store. At first, I assumed these might be residual marks from customers' children during daytime hours that only became visible under certain lighting conditions. But the prints appeared in locations that would be impossible for a child to reach, including areas high up on the windows near the ceiling, and they seemed to form fresh patterns each night, rather than being consistent marks that were simply becoming visible. The combination of the gas smell and the handprints created an atmosphere of mounting dread during what had previously been the quietest, most peaceful hour of my shift. I found myself watching the windows anxiously as 3 a.m. approached, dreading the moment when the familiar odor would begin to fill the store and the small handprints would start appearing on the glass. During my 5th week, these phenomena were joined by sounds that made my blood run cold. Along with the gas smell and the handprints, I began hearing what sounded unmistakably like a young child crying somewhere inside the store. The crying was not loud or hysterical, but rather the quiet, desperate sobbing of a frightened child calling for her mother. The voice seemed to move around the store, sometimes coming from near the magazine racks, sometimes from the back storage area, and occasionally from directly behind me, even when I was certain no one else was in the building. The crying would continue for the entire duration of the gas smell, stopping abruptly when the odor finally dissipated around 4 a.m. These experiences were beginning to seriously affect my mental health and job performance. I was losing sleep during my daytime rest periods, constantly anxious about what I might encounter during the early morning hours, and finding it increasingly difficult to concentrate on my duties while listening for the first signs of the mysterious phenomena. I decided to research the history of the location where the Family Mart had been built, hoping to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. Through online archives and local government records, I discovered that the current store had been constructed on the site of a small apartment building that had been demolished in 2020 following a tragic accident. The apartment building had housed several families, including the Hayashi family, a father who worked as a taxi driver, a mother who stayed home with their 5-year-old daughter Emi, and the little girl who had been described by neighbors as a cheerful, energetic child who loved to help her mother with household tasks. In March of 2020, a gas leak in the building's aging infrastructure had caused an explosion that killed the entire Hayashi family and severely damaged the structure. According to news reports, the leak had been developing slowly over several days, filling the building with dangerous concentrations of gas before igniting from an unknown source. The most heartbreaking detail in these reports was that little Emi had been found in a location suggesting she had been trying to reach her parents' bedroom when the explosion occurred. Witnesses reported hearing a child crying for help in the moments after the explosion, before emergency responders could reach the scene. Understanding this history provided context for what I was experiencing, but it also made the nightly phenomena infinitely more disturbing. The gas smell, the small handprints, and the crying voice all seemed to be manifestations of little Emi's final moments, trapped in a gas-filled building and desperately trying to find her parents before the explosion claimed her life. I consulted with my grandmother, who had always been knowledgeable about traditional spiritual matters, about how to handle this situation respectfully and safely. She explained that children who die in traumatic circumstances often become earthbound spirits, especially when they die feeling lost, frightened, and separated from their families. The little one is probably still looking for her parents, grandmother said sadly. She doesn't understand that they're all gone, so she keeps trying to call for help the way she did during those final moments. Grandmother provided me with several protective omamori, specifically blessed for children's spirits, and she taught me how to offer prayers and simple food offerings that might provide comfort to Emi's restless soul. She emphasized that the goal was not to drive the spirit away, but rather to help her understand that she was safe and no longer needed to search for her parents in fear and confusion. Following grandmother's guidance, I began bringing small offerings to work with me, child-friendly snacks like chocolate and juice boxes, which I would place near the store's small shrine area during the quiet early morning hours. I also started speaking aloud to Emi's presence, using the gentle tone one would use with a frightened child. Emi-chan, I would say softly, when the gas smell began to fill the store, you don't need to be afraid anymore. The danger is over, and you're safe now. Your parents are waiting for you, but you have to stop looking for them here and follow the light that will take you to where they are. These interventions had a gradual but noticeable effect on the phenomena. The gas smell became less intense, the handprints appeared less frequently, and the crying sounds took on a different quality, less desperate and frightened, more like a child who was beginning to feel comforted and understood. However, the situation reached a crisis point during my 7th week, when the manifestations became more intense and potentially dangerous. The gas smell became so strong that I was genuinely concerned about the possibility of an explosion, and the crying grew loud enough that I worried it might be audible to customers or police officers passing by the store. Most alarming was that I began seeing a full apparition of little Emi herself, a small figure in a nightgown, with burns on her arms and face, wandering through the store and reaching up toward the windows as if trying to escape from an invisible fire. The night when I finally saw her complete form, she approached me directly, her small burned hand reaching out as if asking for help. In that moment, I understood that my attempts to comfort her had established a connection, but that she needed more decisive spiritual intervention to find peace. The next morning, I asked Sasaki-san for a few days off, and used the time to arrange for a Buddhist monk from a nearby temple to visit the store and perform a proper memorial service for the Hayashi family. The monk, Ishida-san, was experienced in dealing with spirits of children who had died traumatically, and he agreed to conduct a ceremony that would help Emi and her parents find each other in the afterlife. The memorial service took place during the early morning hours, when the store was closed, with Sasaki-san's permission and participation. Ishida-san set up a temporary altar with photos of the Hayashi family that I had obtained from newspaper archives, along with offerings of food, incense, and flowers that Emi would have enjoyed during her brief life. During the ceremony, as Ishida-san chanted sutras for the peaceful rest of departed souls, the familiar gas smell filled the store one final time. But instead of the frightening intensity of previous occasions, it felt more like a gentle farewell, accompanied by what sounded like a child's voice saying, "Arigatou gozaimasu," thank you very much, before fading away completely. After the memorial service, the supernatural manifestations stopped entirely. The 3 to 4 a.m. period that had been filled with terror and sadness became simply another quiet hour of routine night shift work. The store felt different, too lighter somehow, as if a burden that had been weighing on the space for years had finally been lifted. I continued working the overnight shift for several more months, before finding a daytime position that better suited my long-term career goals. During my remaining time at the Family Mart, I never again experienced anything supernatural, though I maintained a small offering area near the back of the store, where I would occasionally leave flowers or snacks in memory of little Emi and her family. Looking back on this experience, I realize it taught me important lessons about the invisible ways that tragedy continues to affect places long after the physical evidence has been cleared away. The Family Mart was a bright, modern, efficient business, but it was also built on land where a family had died in fear and confusion, leaving behind spiritual energy that needed acknowledgement and proper care. I also learned about the responsibility that comes with encountering earthbound spirits, particularly those of children who died without understanding what was happening to them. Emi's manifestations were not malicious or threatening. They were the desperate attempts of a lost child to find comfort and safety in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible and dangerous. The experience deepened my appreciation for traditional spiritual practices that provide frameworks for helping both the living and the dead process trauma and find peace. The Buddhist memorial service that finally resolved Emi's situation was not an exotic supernatural ritual, but rather a practical application of ancient wisdom about how to help souls transition peacefully from earthly attachments to whatever comes after death. Even now, years later, whenever I pass by that Family Mart or similar convenience stores built on previously developed land, I'm reminded that every location in Tokyo has its own hidden history of families, dreams, tragedies, and unfinished business. Most of the time, these histories remain invisible, but occasionally, under the right circumstances, they emerge to remind us that the past is never truly past, and that our responsibility to care for one another extends beyond the boundaries of life and death. The night shift at that Family Mart taught me to approach unexplained phenomena with compassion rather than fear, and to remember that behind every ghost story is a real person who once lived, loved, and suffered in ways that deserve our respect and understanding. The Balcony Garden. My name is Sachiko Yamada, and I'm a 35-year-old housewife and mother of 2 young children. What I'm about to share happened during our first year living in a subsidized housing complex in Adachi Ward, where we moved in the spring of 2023 after my husband's salary was reduced and we could no longer afford our previous apartment. The supernatural events I experienced on our third floor balcony have fundamentally changed how I understand the connections between the living and the dead, especially in housing situations where economic necessity forces families to accept accommodations with tragic histories. My husband Takeshi works as a junior manager at a small manufacturing company, and our combined income had become insufficient to maintain our previous rental in a more expensive area of Tokyo. When his company reduced wages across all departments due to economic pressures, we were forced to seek more affordable housing options, which led us to apply for subsidized family housing through the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. The application process was lengthy and competitive, with many families competing for limited units that offered below-market rents in exchange for accepting certain restrictions and compromises. We were grateful when our application was approved for a 3-bedroom apartment in an Adachi complex, even though the location was further from Takeshi's work and required longer commutes for our children to reach their schools. Our new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 6-story building constructed in the 1980s, with a layout typical of family housing from that era. A small entrance genkan, a combined living and dining area, 3 modest bedrooms, and a compact balcony facing west toward the late afternoon Sunday. The apartment had been recently cleaned and repainted, giving it a fresh appearance that helped mask any traces of previous occupants. During the initial apartment viewing, the housing authority representative, Watanabe-san, we had mentioned that we were required to acknowledge the property's classification as Jiko Buken, an accident property where an unnatural death had occurred within the past 3 years. He explained this designation in the bureaucratic language required by law, noting that the previous tenant had passed away by suicide and that the apartment had been vacant for several months before being offered to new residents. The reduced rent that came with this designation was one of the factors that made the apartment affordable for our family, though I felt uncomfortable with the knowledge that someone had died in the space where we would be raising our children. Takeshi, ever practical, pointed out that we had limited housing options within our budget, and that the apartment itself was well maintained and suitable for our needs. We moved in during late April, when the spring weather was warming and the cherry blossoms were beginning to fade from the trees visible from our balcony. Our children, 8-year-old Yui and 6-year-old Kenta, were excited about having their own rooms for the first time, and they quickly adapted to the new apartment with the resilience typical of young children. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. I established new routines for household management, found local shops for daily needs, and began developing relationships with neighbors who had children of similar ages to ours. The building had a friendly atmosphere, with many young families facing similar economic challenges and supporting each other through the various difficulties of urban life. The first unusual incident occurred during our 3rd week of residence, when I went out to the balcony to hang laundry and found several dead potted plants arranged along the railing. The plants appeared to be small flowering varieties, pansies, petunias, and marigolds that had been carefully placed in decorative containers but had clearly been dead for some time. My initial assumption was that these were remnants from the previous tenant that had somehow been overlooked during the apartment cleaning process. I disposed of the dead plants in containers, thinking nothing more of the incident, except to note that the previous resident had apparently enjoyed gardening, despite the tragic circumstances that had ended his life. But the next morning, I found fresh plants in the same locations where I had removed the dead ones the day before. These new plants were healthy and vibrant, with bright blooms and moist soil, as if they had been recently purchased and carefully arranged by someone who understood proper gardening techniques. I was puzzled by this discovery, as I was certain I had disposed of all the plants the previous day, and no one else in our family had any interest in gardening or access to plant supplies. When I asked Takeshi about it, he suggested that perhaps I had missed some plants during my initial cleaning, or that a neighbor had kindly left them as a welcoming gesture. This pattern continued for the remainder of our first month in the apartment. Each morning, I would find dead plants on the balcony and dispose of them, only to discover fresh, healthy plants in the same locations the following day. The varieties changed regularly, sometimes spring flowers like tulips and daffodils, other times seasonal blooms like azaleas or early summer flowers, but the arrangement always showed careful attention to color, coordination, and aesthetic appeal. I began to feel increasingly unsettled by this daily cycle of death and renewal, especially since I could never identify where the fresh plants were coming from, or who might be placing them on our balcony during the night. The building had security measures that should have prevented unauthorized access, and none of our neighbors admitted to any knowledge of the mysterious gardening activity. During our second month of residence, I decided to stay awake one night to observe what was happening on the balcony. I positioned myself near the sliding glass door around 2 a.m., when the building was quiet and I would be able to see any movement on the balcony. What I witnessed that night challenged my understanding of the physical world and introduced me to spiritual phenomena I had never experienced before. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I saw a shadowy figure moving around the balcony, tending to plants that appeared to be visible to him but not to me. The figure was that of a middle-aged man in casual clothing, moving with the careful, methodical motions of someone who genuinely loved gardening and took pride in maintaining beautiful flowers. As I watched through the glass door, I could see him watering plants, adjusting their positions for optimal sunlight, and even speaking softly to them, in the way that devoted gardeners often do. But from my perspective, he appeared to be caring for empty containers or invisible plants, since I could only see the dead flowers that would appear each morning. The realization that I was witnessing the spirit of the previous tenant continuing his earthly routines was both frightening and deeply sad. This man, who had ended his life in despair, seemed to be trapped in a cycle of caring for a garden that existed only in his spiritual perception, unable to understand that his physical life and the plants he loved had both ended. I spent the remainder of that night researching traditional Japanese beliefs about earthbound spirits and the ways that people who die by suicide can become attached to places and activities that provided meaning during their final period of life. I learned that gardens and plants often represent hope, growth, and the continuity of life, making them particularly significant for people struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts. The following day, I sought advice from my mother-in-law, who had always been knowledgeable about spiritual matters and traditional practices for dealing with supernatural situations. I carefully explained what I had been experiencing, emphasizing my concern for both my family's well-being and the apparent suffering of the previous tenant's spirit. "The poor man is still trying to find beauty and purpose through his gardening," she said thoughtfully. "People who take their own lives often become trapped by the activities that once brought them joy, unable to understand that death has separated them from the physical world." She explained that the dead plants I found each morning were likely the spiritual residue of his gardening efforts, visible to the living world but lacking the life force that only living hands can provide to growing things. The fresh plants that appeared each day might be his continued attempts to create the garden he envisioned, manifesting temporarily through spiritual energy before returning to their true state of decay. My mother-in-law provided me with specific guidance for addressing this situation with respect for both the deceased man's memory and my family's need for peace in our home. She gave me incense and prayer supplies for creating a small memorial shrine on the balcony, along with instructions for offering prayers that might help the spirit understand his situation and find peace. She also taught me how to communicate respectfully with earthbound spirits, emphasizing the importance of acknowledging their continued presence, while gently encouraging them to release their attachment to earthly activities and move toward spiritual rest. Following her guidance, I set up a small shrine in the corner of the balcony, using a weatherproof container and traditional offerings, including flowers, incense, and simple foods that might appeal to someone who had lived alone. Each morning, after disposing of the dead plants and before the fresh ones could appear, I would offer prayers for the previous tenant's peaceful rest and express gratitude for his love of beauty and growing things. I also began speaking aloud to his presence, acknowledging his continued care for the garden while gently explaining that he no longer needed to tend physical plants. Your garden was beautiful, I would say, and your love for flowers brings honor to your memory. But now, you can rest and let others appreciate the beauty you created. These spiritual practices had a gradual but noticeable effect on the supernatural activity. The cycle of dead and fresh plants continued, but the arrangements became less frantic and more peaceful, as if the spirit was beginning to understand that his gardening efforts were being acknowledged and appreciated, even if they could no longer sustain living plants. More importantly for my family's daily life, the presence on the balcony began to feel less troubled and more benevolent. Instead of the sense of desperation and confusion that had initially characterized the spiritual activity, there was a growing feeling of acceptance and gratitude for the recognition his continued efforts were receiving. During our 4th month in the apartment, I had what I believe was a direct communication with the previous tenant's spirit. While offering morning prayers at the balcony shrine, I heard a voice speaking softly near my ear, saying, "Arigatou gozaimasu, Yamada-san. My flowers will bloom forever now." From that day forward, the pattern of dead and fresh plants stopped completely. The balcony remained clear of mysterious gardening activity, though I continued to maintain the small memorial shrine as a gesture of respect for the man who had found solace in creating beauty during his final months of life. I also began my own small garden on the balcony, using some of the containers that had appeared during the spiritual manifestations. The plants I chose were simple, hardy varieties that would thrive in our apartment conditions, and I found that gardening provided a peaceful activity that connected me to the previous tenant's love of growing things while establishing my own relationship with the space. My children occasionally ask about the small shrine on the balcony, and I have explained it to them as a way of showing respect for the person who lived in our apartment before us and who cared very much about making beautiful gardens. This has become a teaching opportunity about honoring the memory of others and understanding that every home has its own history of people who lived, loved, and suffered within its walls. Looking back on this experience, I realize it taught me important lessons about the spiritual dimensions of housing situations and the ways that economic necessity can bring families into contact with supernatural phenomena that require sensitivity and respect to manage properly. The subsidized housing program that allowed us to afford our apartment came with the requirement to accept accommodations with tragic histories, but it also provided an opportunity to offer spiritual service to someone who had died in despair and loneliness. By acknowledging the previous tenant's continued presence and providing respectful recognition for his gardening efforts, we were able to transform a potentially frightening situation into an experience of compassion and healing. The experience also deepened my appreciation for traditional spiritual practices that provide frameworks for helping both the living and the dead find peace in challenging circumstances. The Buddhist prayers and shrine offerings that my mother-in-law taught me were not exotic supernatural rituals, but practical applications of ancient wisdom about how to show respect for departed souls while maintaining appropriate boundaries for family safety. Even now, over a year later, I continue to maintain the memorial shrine and my own small garden on the balcony. The plants I grow there are healthy and thriving, nourished by both my daily care and what I believe is the continued spiritual blessing of someone who understood the profound connection between cultivating beauty and finding hope in the midst of life's difficulties. The balcony that once seemed haunted by desperate supernatural activity has become a peaceful space where my family can appreciate the continuity that connects us to previous residents while building our own memories and traditions in home that we now understand. We share with the loving memory of those who came before us. The Practice Room. My name is Mei Suzuki, and I'm a 22-year-old piano student at Tokyo University of the Arts. What I'm about to share happened during my final year of study, when I was struggling to balance my musical education with the financial pressures of living independently in Tokyo. The supernatural encounters I experienced in a small apartment above a music school in Koenji have fundamentally changed how I understand the relationship between artistic passion and spiritual attachment, especially when dreams of musical perfection become so consuming that they transcend the boundaries between life and death. During the spring of 2023, I was facing a housing crisis that threatened my ability to complete my degree program. The apartment I had been sharing with two other music students was being renovated, forcing all of us to find new accommodations within a very limited budget. Most rental properties near the university were prohibitively expensive for students, and the competition for affordable housing was intense among the hundreds of young musicians trying to establish themselves in Tokyo's classical music scene. After weeks of unsuccessful apartment hunting, I discovered a listing for a small studio apartment above Harmony Music Academy, a private music school located in Koenji. The rent was remarkably low for the area, and the location offered the additional advantage of being situated directly above practice rooms that I could potentially rent at a discount as a resident of the building. The music school occupied the first two floors of a narrow three-story building constructed in the 1970s, with the third floor converted into a single small apartment that had been used for student housing for several years. When I met with Nakamura-san, the school director, to view the apartment, he seemed eager to find a responsible tenant who would appreciate the musical environment and respect the building's educational purpose. The apartment itself was modest, but adequate for my needs. A single room with a small kitchen area, a compact bathroom, and large windows that provided good natural light for reading sheet music. The wooden floors had been recently refinished, and the space felt clean and well-maintained despite its age. Most importantly for my financial situation, the rent was approximately half of what I would pay for comparable housing elsewhere in Tokyo. Nakamura-san mentioned that the previous tenant had been a violin student who had lived there for several months before deciding to pursue other opportunities, but he didn't provide specific details about her departure. He emphasized that the apartment came with the privilege of using the school's practice rooms during off hours at a significantly reduced rate, which would save me hundreds of yen per month in practice space rental fees. I signed the lease immediately, grateful to have found affordable housing that would allow me to continue my studies without the crushing financial stress I had been experiencing. The proximity to practice rooms seemed like an ideal solution for a serious music student who needed regular access to quality pianos for daily practice and preparation for upcoming recitals. During my first week in the apartment, I was impressed by how well suited the living situation was to my academic needs. The music school operated from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., providing a structured, productive atmosphere during the day, followed by quiet evening hours that were perfect for studying music theory and preparing for examinations. The practice rooms below were soundproofed, so I rarely heard student activities during regular school hours. However, I began to notice that after the school closed each evening, the building took on a different character entirely. Starting around 10 p.m., I would hear faint sounds of musical practice coming from somewhere below my apartment, despite the fact that all students and faculty had departed hours earlier. Initially, I assumed these sounds were coming from neighboring buildings, or perhaps from students who had been given after-hours access to practice rooms for special preparation sessions. The music was always violin, played with a technical competence that suggested an advanced student working on challenging classical repertoire. But as the weeks passed, I realized that the same musical passage was being repeated every night with obsessive regularity. The piece seemed to be a section from Bach's Partita number 2-inch D minor, specifically the famous Chaconne movement that represents one of the most technically and emotionally demanding works in the violin literature. The mysterious violinist would play the same 32 measures over and over again, each repetition revealing slight variations in interpretation and technique, as if the performer was struggling to achieve a perfect rendition of this incredibly difficult passage. The practice sessions would begin around 10:30 p.m. and continue until approximately 2 a.m., always focusing on the same musical material with increasing intensity and desperation as the night progressed. During my 4th week of residence, I decided to investigate these late-night practice sessions by quietly walking down to the 2nd floor where the music school's practice rooms were located. The building had keys for residents to access common areas, and I was curious to see which student had been granted permission to use the facilities during such unusual hours. What I discovered when I reached the practice room level was deeply unsettling. All the rooms were dark and locked, with no signs of recent use or occupancy. Yet the violin music continued, seeming to come from practice room B, which had been where I could hear the sounds most clearly from my apartment above. When I pressed my ear to the door of practice room B, the music became crystal clear, the same passage from the Bach Chaconne, played with remarkable technical skill, but with an emotional quality that spoke of profound frustration and despair. The violinist would reach the climactic measures of the passage, falter slightly on a particularly difficult double-stop section, then return to the beginning to attempt the passage again. The next morning, I approached Nakamura-san about the late-night practice sessions, asking if he had given any students permission to use the facilities after regular hours. His reaction was immediate and alarmed. "That's impossible," he said firmly. "All practice rooms are locked at 9 p.m., and no students have access to the building after hours. I'm the only person with keys, and I'm always home with my family by 10 o'clock. When I insisted that I had been hearing violin practice every night for weeks, Nakamura-san's expression became troubled, and he asked me to describe exactly what I had been hearing. After I provided details about the specific musical passage and the timing of the practice sessions, he was quiet for a long moment before asking me to sit down for a more serious conversation. "The previous tenant in your apartment was a violin student named Asami Hayashi," he said carefully. "She was an exceptionally talented young woman who had been preparing for entrance auditions to several prestigious music conservatories. The piece she was working on most intensively during her final months here was the Bach Chaconne." He explained that Asami had been under enormous pressure to perfect her audition repertoire, spending hours each day in practice room B, working on technical passages that demanded absolute precision and emotional depth. The Chaconne, in particular, had become an obsession for her, as it was required repertoire for her most desired program. She was a perfectionist who could never quite satisfy herself with her interpretation of that piece. Nakamura-san continued sadly. She would practice the same sections over and over again, becoming increasingly frustrated when she couldn't achieve the level of perfection she demanded from herself. In February of that year, the intense pressure of audition preparation had apparently become overwhelming for Asami. She had been found in practice room B one morning, having taken her own life during what appeared to have been an all-night practice session. The violin was still in her hands, and sheet music for the Chaconne was open on the music stand. "We thought that having another music student living in the apartment might help, normalize the space," Nakamura-san said quietly, "but perhaps Asami's spirit is still trying to complete her work." Understanding this history transformed my perception of the nightly practice sessions from a minor curiosity to a profound encounter with a fellow musician's unfulfilled dreams and artistic struggles. Asami's spirit seemed to be trapped in an endless cycle of practicing the same passage that had represented both her highest aspirations and her deepest source of despair. That evening, I listened to her practice session with new awareness and empathy. The technical perfection she achieved in most measures was remarkable, but I could hear the moment in each repetition where self-doubt and frustration would creep into her playing, causing her to restart the passage rather than accept the slight imperfection that any human performer might naturally experience. As a fellow classical musician, I understood the psychological trap that Asami had fallen into. The pursuit of musical perfection can become so consuming that it transforms from a source of joy and artistic expression into a punishing form of self-criticism that never allows for satisfaction or completion. I decided to seek guidance from Yamamoto Sensei, my primary piano instructor at the university, who was known for his knowledge of both musical pedagogy and traditional Japanese spiritual practices. When I explained my situation, he listened thoughtfully before providing insights that connected musical training with spiritual discipline. The pursuit of perfection in classical music can become a form of spiritual attachment that binds the soul to earthly concerns even after death, he explained. Asami's spirit may be trapped by her inability to accept that artistic growth is a process that extends beyond any single performance or audition. Yamamoto Sensei suggested that I could help Asami's spirit by demonstrating that musical beauty can exist even with technical imperfections, and that the joy of music comes from expression and communication rather than flawless execution. He recommended that I play piano accompaniment to her violin practice sessions, creating a musical dialogue that might help her understand that collaborative music making is more fulfilling than solitary perfectionism. Following his guidance, I began bringing my portable keyboard down to the second floor during Asami's practice times and playing piano accompaniment to the Bach chaconne. The piece was originally written for solo violin, but I improvised a supportive harmonic foundation that complemented her melodic lines. The effect was immediate and profound. When Asami's spirit heard the piano accompaniment, her playing became less frantic and more expressive. Instead of obsessively repeating the same passage, she began to work through the entire movement, accepting small imperfections in favor of maintaining musical flow and emotional continuity. During our musical collaboration, I could sense her presence more clearly, not as a frightening supernatural phenomenon, but as a fellow musician who had become lost in the pursuit of impossible standards. Through our shared performance of the chaconne, I tried to communicate that music is meant to be shared, and that artistic achievement comes from touching listeners' hearts rather than executing every note with mechanical precision. Over the course of several weeks, these nightly musical sessions evolved from desperate practice repetitions into beautiful collaborative performances. Asami's spirit seemed to be rediscovering the joy and emotional depth that had originally drawn her to music, before the pressure of auditions and career concerns had transformed her passion into a source of anxiety and self-doubt. During our final session together, I heard her play the complete chaconne from beginning to end with remarkable beauty and emotional authenticity. When she reached the challenging passage that had previously caused her to restart obsessively, she played through it with confidence, accepting the slight imperfections that made her performance uniquely human and deeply moving. After that night, the practice sessions stopped completely. Practice Room B returned to its normal silence during evening hours, and the spiritual presence that had filled the music school with frustrated artistic energy finally found peace. Before moving out of the apartment at the end of my academic year, I arranged for Yamamoto Sensei to hold a small memorial concert in Practice Room B, featuring performances of pieces that Asami had been working on during her time at the music school. Several of her former classmates participated, creating a celebration of her musical legacy that honored both her talent and her struggle with the pressures of artistic perfectionism. Looking back on my time living above Harmony Music Academy, I realized that my encounter with Asami's spirit taught me crucial lessons about the relationship between artistic ambition and psychological well-being. Her story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of musical excellence must be balanced with self-compassion and the understanding that artistic growth is a lifelong journey rather than a destination that can be reached through perfect performance. The experience also deepened my appreciation for the collaborative nature of music making and the importance of sharing our artistic struggles with others who can provide support and perspective. Asami's isolation in her perfectionist practice had contributed to her despair, while our musical collaboration helped her spirit find the connection and acceptance that had been missing during her final months of life. Even now, as I continue my own musical career, I carry with me the memory of those late-night sessions in Practice Room B, where I learned that the most beautiful music often emerges not from technical perfection, but from the willingness to share our imperfect, human expressions of beauty with others who understand the challenges and joys of artistic creation. Whenever I perform the Bach Chaconne in recitals or auditions, I think of Asami and try to play with the emotional authenticity and acceptance of human imperfection that we discovered together during those spiritual music lessons that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The washing machine. My name is Tanaka Hiroshi, and I've been working as a building superintendent for over 15 years, managing residential properties throughout Tokyo's eastern wards. What I'm about to share happened during my tenure managing a 6-story apartment building in Sumida, where I encountered supernatural phenomena that fundamentally changed my understanding of how tragic events can leave lasting spiritual imprints on the everyday spaces where families live and work. The experiences I had in that building's shared laundry room have haunted me for years, serving as a constant reminder of the invisible burdens that building managers must sometimes carry alongside their routine maintenance responsibilities. I began working at the Sumida building in the spring of 2022, taking over from the previous superintendent, who had left suddenly without providing much detail about his reasons for departure. The building was constructed in the 1980s and housed 36 families in modest 2- and 3-bedroom apartments, primarily serving middle-income workers and their families who needed affordable housing within commuting distance of central Tokyo. My responsibilities included general maintenance, rent collection, tenant relations, and overseeing the building's shared facilities, which included a laundry room on the ground floor, equipped with 6 washing machines and 4 dryers for tenant use. This laundry facility was particularly important for families with young children, as most apartments in the building lacked space for full-sized washing equipment. The building had a generally positive atmosphere, with friendly tenant relationships and few of the conflicts that often arise in dense urban housing situations. Most residents were long-term tenants who had established comfortable routines and looked out for each other's children and elderly family members. My job was straightforward and manageable, involving routine maintenance tasks and occasional mediation of minor disputes over parking spaces or noise levels. However, I began noticing unusual problems with the laundry room during my second month on the job. Tenants started complaining that the washing machines would occasionally run cycles during the night, creating noise that disturbed residents in apartments near the ground floor. The machines were supposed to be locked after 11 p.m. to prevent late-night disturbances, but somehow they were operating despite being secured. Initially, I assumed this was a mechanical problem with the timers or electrical systems in the older machines. I contacted the maintenance company that serviced the equipment, and they performed thorough inspections of all 6 washers, but found no mechanical faults that could explain the nighttime operation. The mysterious laundry cycles continued to occur several times per week, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always lasting exactly 38 minutes, which was the standard wash cycle duration. What puzzled me most was that the machines would complete full cycles, including rinse and spin, but when I checked them the following morning, they were always empty. During my third month managing the building, the situation became more disturbing when I began finding clothes in the machines that didn't belong to any current tenants. These were tiny infant garments, onesies, sleepers, and small blankets in soft pastel colors that appeared to be freshly washed and carefully folded, despite the fact that no families with babies that young currently lived in the building. The clothes were always damp, as if they had just completed a wash cycle, and they were folded with the precise care that mothers typically use when handling their baby's clothing. But when I inquired among all the tenants about the source of these garments, no one claimed ownership or had any explanation for how they had appeared in the machines. This pattern continued for several weeks. Nighttime wash cycles in locked machines, followed by the morning discovery of tiny, damp baby clothes that belonged to no one in the building. I began keeping a log of these incidents, hoping to identify some pattern that might explain the phenomenon through normal means. My investigation took a darker turn when I decided to research the building's history through city records and previous tenant documentation. What I discovered in the municipal archives fundamentally changed my understanding of what I was dealing with in the laundry room. 3 years earlier, the building had been the site of a tragic murder-suicide involving a young mother named Sato Yuki and her 6-month-old daughter Hana. According to police reports, Sato-san had been struggling with severe postpartum depression following her husband's departure, leaving her to care for the infant alone while dealing with financial stress and social isolation. The incident had occurred in the building's laundry room during the early morning hours of a cold February night. Sato-san had apparently brought her baby to the laundry room, filled one of the washing machines with water, and drowned the infant before taking her own life by hanging herself from the ceiling pipes using clothesline cord. The tragedy had been discovered by another tenant who had come to the laundry room early the next morning to start a load of wash before work. Both mother and child were found in the laundry room, with tiny baby clothes scattered around the scene, suggesting that Sato-san had been doing laundry for her daughter before the final tragic moments. Understanding this history provided context for the supernatural phenomena I had been experiencing, but it also made the situation infinitely more disturbing. The nighttime wash cycles and the appearance of baby clothes seemed to be manifestations of Sato-san's final attempts to care for her daughter, trapped in an endless repetition of the maternal duties that had defined her increasingly desperate final weeks. The clothes that appeared in the machines each morning were always the type that a loving mother would choose for her baby: soft, clean, carefully selected garments that represented the continuing bond between parent and child even after death had separated them. The precise folding suggested that Sato-san's spirit was still performing the small acts of care that had once brought meaning to her isolated existence. I consulted with Ogawa-san, an elderly Buddhist monk at a nearby temple who had experience helping families deal with spiritual disturbances related to tragic deaths. When I described the situation, he listened with the patient attention of someone who had encountered similar cases before. The young mother's spirit is trapped by her inability to complete her final act of caring for her child, he explained. She continues to wash and fold clothes for the baby, perhaps trying to undo the terrible thing she did in her moment of despair. Ogawa-san explained that cases involving the deaths of children often created particularly strong spiritual attachments, as the natural parental instinct to protect and care for offspring can persist beyond death, especially when the parent was responsible for the child's death. The laundry room represented both the site of the tragedy and Sato-san's final attempt to perform normal maternal duties. He provided guidance for addressing the situation with respect for both the deceased mother and child, emphasizing that the goal should be helping Sato-san's spirit find peace rather than simply eliminating the supernatural disturbances. This would require acknowledging her continuing love for her daughter while helping her understand that her earthly responsibilities had ended. Following Ogawa, San's instructions, I set up a small memorial shrine in the corner of the laundry room, using a weatherproof cabinet to house offerings of flowers, incense, and simple food items that might appeal to a young mother and her baby. I also placed a small collection of clean baby clothes in the shrine as a way of honoring Sato, San's continuing desire to care for her daughter. Each morning when I found the mysterious baby clothes in the machines, I would carefully place them in the memorial shrine rather than disposing of them, treating them as sacred offerings from a mother's love that transcended death. I would also offer prayers for both Sato-san and little Hana's peaceful rest, acknowledging their suffering while encouraging them to release their attachment to earthly concerns. These spiritual practices had a gradual but noticeable effect on the supernatural activity. The nighttime wash cycles became less frequent, and when they did occur, they seemed less frantic and desperate. The baby clothes that appeared in the machines were still carefully folded, but they began to feel more like gifts or blessings rather than manifestations of trapped desperation. During my 6th month managing the building, I had what I believe was a direct encounter with Sato, San's spirit. I was performing routine maintenance in the laundry room late one evening when I heard the soft sound of someone humming a lullaby. When I looked around, I saw a young woman in a simple dress standing near the washing machines, gently folding tiny clothes with the loving attention that only a mother can provide. She looked up at me with eyes filled with gratitude and sadness, and I understood that she appreciated the respect and care I had shown for her continuing efforts to express love for her daughter. In that moment, I felt a profound connection to her struggle and her enduring maternal devotion, despite the tragic circumstances that had led to her death. "Hana-chan is safe now," I said quietly, using the affectionate diminutive for her daughter's name. "You've taken such good care of her clothes. She knows how much you love her." Sato, San's spirit, smiled through her tears and bowed deeply before slowly fading away, leaving behind a sense of peace and resolution that I had never felt in the laundry room before. After that encounter, the supernatural activity stopped completely. The washing machines returned to normal operation, running only when tenants actually used them during regular hours. No more mysterious baby clothes appeared, and the laundry room took on the ordinary, functional atmosphere appropriate for a shared building facility. However, I maintained the memorial shrine in the corner of the laundry room, explaining to tenants that it honored a former resident and her child who had lived in the building. Most tenants understood and respected this small gesture, and some would occasionally leave flowers or offer brief prayers when they came to do their laundry. The experience taught me important lessons about the hidden responsibilities that come with managing residential buildings where people have lived, loved, and suffered through the full range of human experiences. As building superintendents, we're not just maintaining physical structures. We're also stewards of the emotional and spiritual energy that accumulates in places where families face their greatest challenges and tragedies. I also gained a deeper appreciation for the isolation and desperation that some young mothers experience, especially when they lack adequate support systems during the difficult early months of childcare. Sato, San's tragedy reminded me that behind every apartment door are real people, dealing with pressures and struggles that may not be visible to neighbors or building management. Looking back on my time managing that Sumida building, I realized that my encounter with Sato, San's spirit, was ultimately a lesson in compassion and the importance of acknowledging suffering even when we cannot prevent or resolve it. By treating her continuing maternal instincts with respect and providing a dignified way for her to express her love for her daughter, I was able to help her find the peace that had eluded her during her final desperate weeks of life. Even now, years later, I carry with me the memory of that young mother's dedication to caring for her child, even in death. Whenever I encounter tenants who seem to be struggling with family pressures or social isolation, I try to offer whatever support I can within my role as building superintendent, understanding that sometimes a small gesture of recognition and care can make a significant difference in someone's ability to cope with overwhelming challenges. The laundry room where Sato-san and Hana died has returned to its ordinary function as a shared facility where families wash clothes and maintain the daily routines that hold their lives together. But I will always remember it as a place where I learned that love between parent and child can transcend even the most tragic circumstances, and that our responsibility to care for one another extends beyond the boundaries of life and death. The delivery route. My name is Takeshi Kawamura, and I work as a food delivery driver for Yokohama-ya, a popular restaurant chain that specializes in katsu sandwiches and bento boxes throughout Tokyo's eastern districts. What I'm about to share happened during the autumn and winter of 2023, when I was assigned a delivery route that included a specific apartment complex in Katsushika that became the source of supernatural encounters that fundamentally changed my understanding of social isolation and the invisible connections between those who provide services and those who desperately need them. I had been working for Yokohama-ya for about 2 years, primarily delivering to office workers during lunch hours and families ordering dinner during evening shifts. The job provided decent income for someone without a university degree, and I enjoyed the independence of traveling throughout the city on my delivery scooter, meeting different customers, and learning about the diverse neighborhoods that make up Tokyo's sprawling urban landscape. My route included several apartment complexes, office buildings, and residential areas in Katsushika, Sumida, and Edogawa wards, serving customers who ordered through our restaurant's mobile app or by calling our central dispatch number. Most deliveries were routine-hungry workers grabbing quick meals, families ordering dinner when parents worked late, or elderly customers who found it convenient to have restaurant-quality food brought to their homes. The apartment complex that would become the center of my supernatural experiences was located on a quiet side street in Katsushika, a 6-story building constructed in the 1970s that housed primarily single residents and small families. The building had a somewhat run-down appearance, with faded exterior paint and narrow hallways that suggested it catered to tenants with limited financial resources. During my first year delivering to this building, I had served several regular customers, including an elderly woman who ordered traditional bento boxes twice a week, a young couple who frequently ordered katsu sandwiches for weekend meals, and a few office workers who would order lunch to be delivered during their work-from-home days. One of my most frequent customers in that building was a man who lived in apartment 403 and who placed orders almost daily through the mobile app. His orders were always the same: 1 katsu sandwich combo with extra sauce, 1 miso soup, and 1 can of coffee. The orders were prepaid through the app, and his delivery instructions always specified to leave the food outside his door and knock twice to confirm delivery. I never actually met this customer face to face, but I could sometimes hear movement inside the apartment when I made deliveries, and I assumed he was simply a shy person who preferred to avoid social interaction with delivery personnel. This type of customer was not unusual in my experience. Many people, especially those working from home or dealing with social anxiety, preferred the convenience of contactless delivery. This customer's orders continued regularly throughout the spring and early summer of 2023, always with the same items and the same delivery instructions. The frequency of orders, sometimes daily, rarely less than 4 times per week, suggested that he relied heavily on restaurant delivery for his nutritional needs, rather than shopping for groceries or cooking at home. During late June, I began to notice that the food I delivered to apartment 403 was not being collected promptly. Instead of the usual pattern where items would be taken inside within minutes of delivery, the bags and containers would sit outside the door for extended periods, sometimes still there when I returned for subsequent deliveries days later. Initially, I assumed this might be due to the customer's work schedule, or perhaps he was traveling and had forgotten to cancel his standing orders. However, as the summer progressed, the accumulation of uncollected deliveries became more concerning. By July, there would be stacks of rotting food containers outside apartment 403, creating an unpleasant odor in the hallway and attracting insects. When I brought this situation to the attention of my supervisor at Yokohamaya, he instructed me to continue making the deliveries, as long as the orders kept coming through the app with valid payment. Our company policy was to fulfill confirmed orders regardless of whether customers actually collected their food, as we had already received payment and our liability ended once we completed the delivery as requested. However, the situation began to feel increasingly wrong to me as the pile of rotting food grew larger and the smell in the hallway became unbearable. Other tenants in the building started complaining about the odor, and I felt responsible for contributing to an unsanitary situation that was affecting the entire floor. During the first week of August, I decided to knock on the door of apartment 403 to check on the customer's welfare, despite his clear preference for avoiding personal contact. When I knocked and called out that I had his delivery, there was no response from inside the apartment. The silence felt different from the usual quiet, not just the absence of movement, but a profound emptiness that suggested no one was present. I contacted the building superintendent, Yamada-san, to express my concerns about the uncollected deliveries and the possibility that something had happened to the tenant. Yamada-san explained that he had been receiving complaints about the smell, but had been reluctant to enter the apartment without clear evidence of an emergency. Together, we decided to ask the police to conduct a welfare check on the resident of apartment 403. When officers arrived and gained entry to the apartment, they discovered that the tenant, a 32-year-old man named Kobayashi Satoru, had died several weeks earlier, apparently from malnutrition and dehydration related to prolonged social isolation and depression. The apartment was filled with unopened food delivery containers, dating back months, suggesting that Kobayashi-san had been ordering food regularly but had gradually lost the ability or motivation to eat, eventually becoming too weak to even collect the deliveries from outside his door. The scene painted a heartbreaking picture of someone who had slowly starved to death, despite having food delivered to his doorstep every day. The discovery of Kobayashi-san's death affected me profoundly, as I realized that I had been unknowingly participating in the final months of his life, delivering food that represented his last connection to the outside world, even as he became increasingly unable to sustain himself. The fact that his orders had continued to be processed automatically through the app for weeks after his death added a surreal, technological dimension to the tragedy. After the apartment was cleaned and sealed by authorities, I assumed that my deliveries to apartment 403 would end permanently. However, approximately 2 weeks after Kobayashi-san's body was discovered, new orders began appearing in my delivery queue for the same apartment, with the same items and the same delivery instructions. When I questioned this with my supervisor, he checked the app system and confirmed that the orders were coming through with valid payment information, though he couldn't explain how this was possible given that the previous account holder was deceased and the apartment was supposedly vacant. My first delivery to apartment 403, after learning about Kobayashi-san's death, was profoundly unsettling. As I approached the building on my scooter, I felt an unusual heaviness in the air, and my normally reliable vehicle began to lose power and slow down significantly, as if something was creating resistance against my forward movement. When I reached the 4th floor and approached the apartment door, I could see that the hallway had been cleaned and disinfected, with no trace of the accumulated food containers that had been there for months. But as I placed the new delivery outside the door and prepared to knock twice as instructed, I heard movement from inside the apartment, the same soft shuffling sounds I had occasionally heard during my previous deliveries. More disturbing was the visual encounter I had when I glanced toward the apartment's window while walking back down the hallway. In the window, I could see the pale, gaunt figure of a man, watching me with an expression of desperate hunger and gratitude. The figure was clearly Kobayashi-san, but he appeared emaciated and translucent, as if he existed only partially in the physical world. This pattern continued for the remainder of the summer and into the autumn. Orders would appear for apartment 403 several times per week. My scooter would slow down when approaching the building, and I would see Kobayashi-san's spirit watching me from his window with the same hopeful expression of someone expecting a meal delivery. The supernatural aspect of these deliveries became more intense as the weeks passed. Sometimes I would hear Kobayashi-san's voice calling out "Arigatou gozaimasu" when I completed the delivery, thanking me with the polite formality that hikikomori individuals often use when forced to interact with service providers. Other times, I would find that the food containers I left outside his door would be empty the following day, as if he had somehow consumed their contents despite being deceased. I began to understand that Kobayashi-san's spirit was trapped in the routine that had defined his final months of life, ordering food deliveries that represented his primary connection to human society, even though he was no longer capable of benefiting from the nourishment they provided. The situation was affecting my mental health and job performance. I began to dread the route through Katsushika, especially deliveries to that specific building. The supernatural encounters were becoming more frequent and intense, and I was struggling to maintain my professional demeanor while dealing with the emotional weight of Kobayashi-san's continued presence. I decided to seek guidance from Tanaka-san, an elderly Buddhist monk at a temple near my home who was known for helping people deal with spiritual disturbances related to urban living situations. When I explained my experiences, he listened with the patient understanding of someone who had encountered similar cases. "The young man's spirit is still hungry," Tanaka-san explained, "but not for physical food. He's hungry for human connection and acknowledgement that his life had meaning. The food deliveries were his only regular contact with another person, and he's unable to let go of that connection even in death." Tanaka-san taught me how to approach Kobayashi-san's spirit with compassion, while helping him understand that his earthly needs had ended. He provided me with incense and prayer supplies to create a small offering at the apartment door, along with specific words to speak that would acknowledge Kobayashi-san's struggle with isolation while encouraging him to find peace. Following Tanaka-san's guidance, I began treating my deliveries to apartment 403 as spiritual service, rather than simply fulfilling app orders. When I arrived with the food, I would light a small stick of incense, place it near the apartment door, along with the delivery, and speak quietly to Kobayashi-san's spirit. "Kobayashi-san," I would say, "I see that you're still waiting for your food. You were a good customer who always ordered politely and paid promptly. But now you don't need to be hungry anymore. You can rest peacefully and let go of waiting for deliveries." These spiritual practices gradually changed the nature of my encounters with Kobayashi-san's spirit. The desperate, hungry expression I saw in his window was replaced by a more peaceful countenance, and the mechanical slowing of my scooter became less pronounced. The supernatural activity began to feel less like a trap and more like a form of ongoing conversation between two people who had shared a regular routine. During my final delivery to apartment 403, in late November, I had what I believe was a direct farewell encounter with Kobayashi-san's spirit. When I placed the food outside his door and offered my usual prayers, I heard his voice clearly speaking through the door. "Takeshi-san, arigatou gozaimasu for all the deliveries. I don't need to order food anymore." From that day forward, no more orders appeared in my delivery queue for apartment 403. The supernatural encounters stopped completely, and the building returned to its normal atmosphere of quiet residential life. However, the experience fundamentally changed my approach to my work as a delivery driver. I began to pay more attention to customers who seemed isolated, or who displayed patterns that might indicate social withdrawal or depression. When I encountered situations that seemed concerning, I would make gentle inquiries or suggest resources for people who might be struggling with isolation. I also started volunteering with a local organization that provides meal delivery and wellness checks for elderly and isolated residents, understanding now how crucial these regular human contacts can be for people who have become disconnected from family and community support systems. Looking back on my supernatural encounters with Kobayashi-san's spirit, I realize they taught me important lessons about the invisible relationships that develop between service providers and customers, especially those who rely on regular deliveries as their primary connection to the outside world. The tragedy of Kobayashi-san's death was not just that he starved in his apartment, but that he died alone despite having daily contact with another human being who could have potentially intervened if I had recognized the warning signs earlier. His spirit's continued ordering of food deliveries represented his desperate need for human acknowledgement and care that had gone unmet during his final months. Even now, years later, when I make deliveries to customers who prefer contactless service, I pay careful attention to patterns that might indicate isolation or distress. I understand that my work involves more than simply transporting food. I'm often serving as a lifeline for people who have become disconnected from normal social support systems. The route through Katsushika continues to be part of my regular delivery area, and I still pass by the building where Kobayashi-san lived and died. The apartment has been rented to new tenants, and normal life has resumed in the building. But I will always remember it as the place where I learned that supernatural encounters can sometimes be calls for compassion and understanding rather than sources of fear, and that our responsibility to care for isolated members of our community extends beyond the boundaries of our official job duties. The Childcare Assistant. My name is Emi Watanabe, and I'm a 24-year-old part-time worker at Sunshine Nursery School, a small daycare center located in a converted apartment building in Koto Ward. What I'm about to share happened during my first year working there, in 2023, when I encountered supernatural phenomena that fundamentally changed my understanding of maternal love and the spiritual connections that can persist between mothers and children even after death has separated them. I had recently completed my childcare certification and was eager to begin working with young children, having always felt a natural affinity for their innocent energy and boundless curiosity about the world. The position at Sunshine Nursery School was my first professional job in childcare, and I was grateful to find work at a facility that emphasized nurturing individual development rather than simply providing institutional supervision for working parents. The nursery school occupied the ground floor and part of the second floor of a 3-story building that had been converted from residential apartments into educational use. The renovation had been completed about 5 years earlier, transforming the former living spaces into bright, child-friendly classrooms, equipped with age-appropriate furniture, educational materials, and safety features required for licensed childcare facilities. My responsibilities included assisting the head teacher, Nakamura Sensei, with daily activities for children aged 2 to 4 years old, including meal supervision, educational play sessions, outdoor activities, and the afternoon nap time that was an essential part of the daily schedule for young children who needed regular rest periods. The building itself had an interesting layout that reflected its origins as residential apartments. The main classroom occupied what had once been the living room and kitchen area of a large apartment, while smaller rooms that had been bedrooms were converted into spaces for quiet activities, storage, and the naptime area where children would rest on small futons during the early afternoon hours. During my first month at the nursery school, I was impressed by how well the converted space worked for childcare purposes. The rooms had good natural light, adequate ventilation, and a warm, homey atmosphere that helped children feel comfortable and secure during their time away from their families. Most of the children adapted well to the daily routine and seemed to enjoy both the structured activities and free play periods. However, I began to notice some unusual aspects of the building during nap time periods, when the children would rest quietly on their futons in the dimly lit room that had once been a bedroom in the original apartment layout. Several children, particularly the more sensitive ones, would have difficulty sleeping and would often wake up reporting strange dreams or claiming to have seen someone in the room who wasn't supposed to be there. The most frequent reports came from 3-year-old Yuki, a particularly observant little girl who would often wake up from her nap and ask me about the sad mama she said had been watching the children sleep. According to Yuki, this woman would walk quietly around the nap time room, checking on each child, and sometimes humming soft lullabies that helped the children feel peaceful and secure. Initially, I assumed these reports were typical childhood imagination, or perhaps confused memories of their own mothers putting them to sleep at home. Young children often have vivid dreams and can sometimes confuse dream experiences with waking reality, especially in the drowsy state between sleep and full consciousness. But as the weeks passed, more children began reporting similar encounters with the mysterious sad mama during nap time. 4-year-old Kenta described a woman who would sit beside his futon and gently stroke his hair when he had trouble falling asleep. 2-year-old Hana, who was still developing her vocabulary, would point toward empty corners of the room and say, "Mama there," in a way that suggested she could see someone the adults couldn't perceive. What made these reports particularly intriguing was the consistency of the children's descriptions. They all described a woman with long, dark hair who wore simple clothing and who seemed particularly concerned about making sure the children were comfortable and well cared for during their rest time. The children never seemed frightened by her presence, quite the opposite. They spoke of her with affection and gratitude. During my 3rd month at the nursery school, I began to hear the sounds that the children had been reporting. While supervising nap time in the quiet, dimmed room, I would occasionally hear soft humming or quiet singing coming from somewhere within the building, though I could never identify the exact source of the music. The melodies were traditional Japanese lullabies, the kind that mothers have sung to their children for generations to help them fall asleep peacefully. The voice was gentle and melodic, with the patient, loving tone that only someone who truly cares for children can achieve when singing them to sleep. At first, I thought the sounds might be coming from one of the other staff members, or perhaps from a neighboring building. But when I investigated during these episodes, I found that all the other adults were occupied with different tasks in other parts of the building, and the surrounding area was typically quiet during the afternoon hours. The singing seemed to have a genuinely calming effect on the children. During nap time periods when I could hear the lullabies, the children would fall asleep more easily and rest more peacefully than usual. Even the most restless children, who normally had difficulty with afternoon naps, would settle down quickly when the mysterious singing began. I decided to discuss these observations with Nakamura-sensei, who had been working at the nursery school since it opened, and would be familiar with any unusual aspects of the building or its history. When I carefully described what the children had been reporting and the sounds I had been hearing, her reaction indicated that this was not the first time such experiences had been brought to her attention. "Several of our previous staff members have mentioned similar things," she said thoughtfully. "We've always assumed it was related to the building's history before it became a nursery school. But since the phenomena seemed to be beneficial for the children rather than frightening or disruptive, we've simply learned to accept it as part of the environment here." Nakamura-sensei explained that before the building was converted into a nursery school, it had been residential apartments, housing several families with young children. One of the apartments had been the site of a family tragedy involving a young single mother who had been struggling with severe postpartum depression and the overwhelming stress of caring for her toddler without adequate support systems. According to the information she had been given when the nursery school was established, the mother, Sato Tomoko, had been found deceased in her apartment along with her 18-month-old son, Hiroshi. The circumstances suggested that she had accidentally suffocated the child during a period of psychological crisis, then taken her own life out of grief and despair over what she had done. The apartment where the tragedy occurred has been sealed off and is not part of our nursery school space, Nakamura-sensei explained. But the children's naptime room is adjacent to where Sato-san's bedroom used to be, separated only by a wall that was part of the original apartment layout. Understanding this history provided context for the supernatural phenomena I had been experiencing, but it also made the situation more emotionally complex. The sad mama the children described was likely Sato-san's spirit, still trying to care for children in the way she had been unable to properly care for her own son during her final weeks of life. The lullabies I heard during nap time were probably her attempts to provide the gentle, loving attention that she had wanted to give her own child, but had been prevented from giving due to her mental health struggles and lack of support. In death, she seemed to be fulfilling her maternal instincts by watching over the children who now rested in a space so close to where she had experienced her greatest tragedy. I began to approach these supernatural encounters with a different perspective, understanding that Sato-san's presence represented her continuing desire to be a good mother and to ensure that children received the care and attention they needed to feel safe and loved. Her spirit seemed to be providing supplemental comfort to the children during their vulnerable moments of rest and sleep. However, I also recognized that this situation required careful management to ensure that the children's experiences remained positive and that parents understood what was happening in a way that wouldn't cause unnecessary concern or alarm. I consulted with Hayashi-san, a Buddhist monk at a nearby temple, who had experience helping families deal with spiritual matters involving children and deceased parents. When I explained the situation, he listened with understanding and provided guidance for creating a respectful environment that honored Sato-san's maternal spirit while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The mother's spirit is trying to heal her own grief by caring for other children, he explained. This can be beneficial for both the children and her soul, but it's important to acknowledge her presence properly and ensure that she understands her role as a protective guardian rather than a primary caregiver. Following Hayashi-san's recommendations, I worked with Nakamura-sensei to create a small memorial shrine in the naptime room, positioned near the wall that separated our space from Sato-san's former apartment. The shrine included flowers, incense, and a small photograph of a mother and child that represented all the families who had lived in the building over the years. We also established a routine of offering brief prayers before nap time, thanking any protective spirits for watching over the children and asking for their continued benevolent presence. This practice helped create a formal framework for acknowledging Sato-san's spirit, while teaching the children about respect for those who had lived in the space before them. The effects of these spiritual practices were immediate and positive. The supernatural activity continued, but it took on a more peaceful, organized character. The children still reported seeing the sad mama during nap time, but their descriptions suggested that she seemed less troubled and more content with her role as a protective presence. The lullabies I heard became more regular and predictable, typically beginning about 10 minutes after the children had settled onto their futons and continuing until most of them had fallen asleep peacefully. The singing seemed to follow a natural rhythm that complemented the children's sleep patterns rather than disrupting them. Most importantly, the children's reactions to these experiences remained consistently positive. They spoke of the sad mama with affection and gratitude, often asking me to thank her for helping them sleep well, or for watching over them during their dreams. Several children even began leaving small drawings or flowers near the memorial shrine as gifts for the spirit they had come to regard as a benevolent guardian. During my final months at Sunshine Nursery School, I had what I believe was a direct encounter with Sato, San's spirit. While supervising nap time on a particularly peaceful afternoon, I saw a translucent figure of a young woman moving quietly around the room, gently adjusting blankets and checking on sleeping children with the careful attention of a devoted mother. When she noticed me watching her, instead of disappearing, she smiled with gratitude and bowed slightly in acknowledgement of the respectful treatment her presence had received. In that moment, I understood that our memorial practices and acceptance of her maternal care had provided her spirit with the recognition and purpose that had been missing during her troubled final months of life. After that encounter, the supernatural activity continued, but became even more subtle and integrated into the natural rhythm of the nursery school day. San's presence felt less like a spiritual disturbance and more like a beneficial aspect of the caring environment we were trying to create for the children. When I eventually moved on to a full-time position at a different childcare facility, I made sure to brief my replacement about the building's spiritual history and the practices we had established for honoring San's protective presence. I also emphasized the importance of maintaining the memorial shrine and continuing to acknowledge her role in creating a peaceful environment for the children's rest periods. Looking back on my time at Sunshine Nursery School, I realized that experience taught me valuable lessons about the ways that tragic loss can be transformed into protective love through proper acknowledgement and respect. San's spirit had found a way to heal her own maternal grief by providing care and comfort to other children, creating a situation that benefited both the living and the dead. The experience also deepened my understanding of how traditional spiritual practices can be adapted to modern childcare settings, providing frameworks for managing supernatural phenomena in ways that enhance rather than disrupt the educational environment. The children learned important lessons about respect for those who came before them while receiving additional emotional support during their time away from their families. Even now, working in my current position, I maintain similar practices when I encounter children who seem to need extra comfort or protection. I remember San's gentle presence during those afternoon nap times and tried to provide the same patient, loving attention that she offered to the children who were fortunate enough to experience her spiritual care. The naptime room at Sunshine Nursery School continues to be a place where children rest peacefully under the watchful protection of a mother whose love transcended the boundaries of life and death, transforming personal tragedy into a source of comfort and security for generations of young children who will never know her name, but will always benefit from her enduring maternal devotion. The Study Group. My name is Naoki Hayashi, and I'm a 17-year-old high school student preparing for university entrance examinations at Shinko-juku, a competitive cram school located in Shibuya. What I'm about to share happened during the intense winter study period leading up to the university entrance exams in early 2024, when I encountered supernatural phenomena that fundamentally changed my understanding of academic pressure and the tragic consequences it can have for students who become overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon them. I had been attending Shinko-juku since my second year of high school, when my parents decided that my grades needed improvement if I was going to gain admission to a prestigious university. The Juku was known for its rigorous academic programs and high success rates in placing students at top-tier institutions, though it was also notorious for its demanding schedule and intense competitive atmosphere among students. The cram school occupied a narrow 3-story building that had been converted from residential use several years earlier. The first floor contained administrative offices and smaller classrooms for individual tutoring sessions, while the second and third floors housed larger study halls, where students would spend long hours working on practice exams, homework assignments, and supplementary study materials designed to give them an edge in the highly competitive entrance examination process. My daily routine during the final months before entrance exams involved attending regular high school classes until mid-afternoon, then traveling to Shinkojuku for evening study sessions that often extended until 10 or 11 p.m. The long hours and constant pressure to improve test scores created an atmosphere of chronic stress and exhaustion among students, many of whom were sacrificing sleep, social relationships, and physical health in pursuit of academic achievement. The third-floor study hall where I spent most of my time was a large room filled with individual desks arranged in neat rows, each equipped with a small lamp and storage compartments for textbooks and study materials. The room could accommodate approximately 60 students at a time, and during peak study periods, it was typically filled to capacity with high school students working quietly on various subjects. During my first year at the Juku, I had adapted reasonably well to the demanding schedule and competitive environment, though I noticed that some students seemed to struggle more than others with the pressure and intensity of the academic preparation. Several classmates had dropped out or transferred to less demanding programs when they found themselves unable to cope with the stress of constant studying and frequent examinations. It was during the winter of my final year, when entrance exam preparations reached their most intense phase, that I began to notice unusual phenomena in the third-floor study hall. During late evening sessions, when the number of students had dwindled to perhaps 15 or 20 dedicated individuals, I would occasionally see someone studying at a desk in a section of the room that I was certain had been empty moments earlier. The figure appeared to be a male student, approximately my age, wearing the dark blue uniform of a local public high school that I recognized but couldn't immediately identify. He would be bent over his desk, writing furiously in notebooks or working through practice examination problems with the intense concentration that characterized the most dedicated students at our Juku. What struck me as unusual was that this student never seemed to take breaks, never looked around the room, and never interacted with any of the other students present during the late-night study sessions. He would simply appear at his desk and work continuously until I would glance away for a moment and find that he had vanished, without any indication of when or how he had departed. Initially, I assumed this was simply another student who had a different schedule or study pattern than my own, perhaps someone who preferred to work in isolation and avoided social interaction with classmates. The competitive atmosphere at Shinkojuku certainly encouraged students to focus exclusively on their own academic preparation, rather than forming friendships or engaging in casual conversation. However, as the weeks passed and entrance examinations drew closer, I began to notice that other students were also aware of this mysterious classmate. During brief conversations in the hallway, or while waiting for tutoring sessions, several students mentioned seeing the ghost student who appeared in the study hall during late-night sessions, but never seemed to acknowledge anyone else's presence. More intriguingly, some students reported finding additional study materials in their bags or lockers that they hadn't placed there themselves, completed practice tests, detailed notes on difficult problem-solving techniques, and supplementary worksheets covering topics that were likely to appear on upcoming examinations. These materials were always of extremely high quality, showing advanced understanding of the subject matter and meticulous attention to detail. During my second month of noticing this mysterious student, I had my first direct encounter with evidence of his presence. While packing up my study materials after a particularly long evening session, I discovered a completed mathematics practice exam in my backpack that I had never seen before. The work was exceptional, with every problem solved correctly and explanatory notes written in neat handwriting that demonstrated sophisticated problem-solving strategies. Most surprisingly, the practice exam was signed at the top, with a name I didn't recognize, Tanaka Hiroshi, Class 3B. The handwriting was careful and precise, suggesting someone who took great pride in the presentation of his academic work and wanted to ensure that every detail was perfect. I asked several classmates and instructors about Tanaka Hiroshi, but no one at Shinkojuku seemed to know a student by that name. When I showed the completed practice exam to Yamamoto-sensei, one of the senior mathematics instructors, his reaction was immediately concerned. "Where did you get this?" he asked, examining the paper carefully. "This handwriting. It looks very familiar, but I can't quite place it." After studying the work more closely, Yamamoto-sensei's expression became troubled, and he asked me to stay after class for a private conversation about what I had discovered. Tanaka Hiroshi was a student who attended this juku about 3 years ago. He explained quietly. He was one of the most dedicated and academically gifted students we've ever had, but he became overwhelmed by the pressure of entrance exam preparation. He took his own life during the winter study season. Just a few weeks before the examinations, he had been working so hard to pass. Yamamoto-sensei went on to explain that Tanaka-kun had been found in his family's apartment, having apparently studied until the early morning hours before taking a fatal overdose of sleeping medication. His desk was covered with completed practice exams and study materials, suggesting that he had been working on academic preparation right up until his final moments. The building where our juku is located used to include residential apartments on the upper floors. Yamamoto-sensei continued. Tanaka-kun's family lived in one of those apartments, and he often studied late into the night in what is now our third-floor study hall, which used to be his bedroom. Understanding this history provided context for the supernatural phenomena I had been experiencing, but it also made the situation infinitely more tragic and emotionally complex. Tanaka-kun's spirit seemed to be trapped in an endless cycle of academic preparation, unable to understand that his earthly obligations had ended and that he no longer needed to study for examinations he would never take. The completed practice exams and study materials that students had been finding were apparently Tanaka-kun's continuing attempts to help his fellow students succeed in the academic challenges that had ultimately proven too overwhelming for him to handle. In death, he seemed to be sharing the knowledge and study strategies he had developed during his own intensive preparation, hoping to prevent other students from experiencing the despair that had led to his tragic decision. Over the following weeks, my encounters with Tanaka-kun's presence became more frequent and more direct. During late-night study sessions, I would occasionally hear the sound of pencil on paper coming from the area where I had seen him working, even when all the visible desks in that section were unoccupied. Sometimes I would find additional study materials in my bag, always bearing his name and always demonstrating the meticulous preparation techniques that had characterized his academic approach. Most remarkably, the quality of my own academic performance began to improve significantly. The study strategies evident in Tanaka-kun's materials were more sophisticated and effective than anything I had learned from the regular juku curriculum, and implementing his approaches to problem solving and examination preparation helped me achieve higher scores on practice tests and gain confidence in subjects that had previously been challenging. However, I also began to notice that the intensity of my own study habits was increasing in ways that felt potentially unhealthy. I found myself staying later at the juku, working longer hours on practice problems, and becoming increasingly obsessed with achieving perfect scores rather than simply doing my best effort. The ghost student's dedication was inspiring, but it was also a reminder of how academic pressure could become consuming and destructive. I decided to seek guidance from Watanabe-san, a counselor at my high school, who specialized in helping students manage the stress of entrance exam preparation. When I carefully explained what I had been experiencing, she listened with understanding and provided important perspective on both the supernatural encounters and the underlying academic pressures they represented. "It sounds like this student's spirit is still trapped by the same perfectionist thinking that contributed to his death," she explained. "He's trying to help you and other students, but he may also be unconsciously encouraging the same unhealthy study patterns that proved fatal for him." Watanabe-san helped me develop a more balanced approach to my entrance exam preparation, one that incorporated Tanaka-kun's effective study techniques while maintaining healthy boundaries around sleep, nutrition, and social relationships. She also suggested ways that I might be able to help his spirit find peace by demonstrating that academic success was possible without sacrificing physical and mental health. Following her guidance, I began speaking directly to Tanaka-kun's presence during late-night study sessions, acknowledging his help while also encouraging him to release his attachment to endless academic preparation. Tanaka-kun, I would say quietly, when I sensed his presence in the study hall, thank you for sharing your study materials and helping me improve my academic performance. Your techniques are very effective, and I'm grateful for your guidance. But you don't need to keep studying anymore. You've already done enough, and you can rest now. I also made a point of maintaining balance in my own study routine, taking regular breaks, getting adequate sleep, and spending time with friends and family, rather than devoting every waking moment to academic preparation. I wanted to demonstrate to Tanaka-kun's spirit that it was possible to work hard toward academic goals without losing sight of other important aspects of life. These practices had a gradual but noticeable effect on the supernatural activity in the study hall. Tanaka-kun's appearances became less frequent and less frantic, and when I did encounter evidence of his presence, it felt more peaceful and supportive rather than driven by desperate urgency. The study materials that appeared in my bag continued to be helpful, but they also began to include notes about the importance of maintaining perspective and not allowing academic pressure to overwhelm other priorities. It seemed that Tanaka-kun's spirit was beginning to understand the message about balance and healthy boundaries. During my final month of entrance exam preparation, I had what I believe was a direct farewell encounter with Tanaka-kun's spirit. While studying alone in the third-floor hall late one evening, I looked up to see him sitting at his usual desk, but instead of frantically working on practice problems, he was simply watching me with an expression of pride and gratitude. When our eyes met, he smiled and bowed slightly before, slowly fading away, leaving behind a sense of completion and peaceful resolution that I had never felt in the study hall before. I performed well on my university entrance examinations and was accepted to my first-choice institution, achieving my academic goals while maintaining the healthy balance that Watanabe-san had helped me develop. I believe that Tanaka-kun's study techniques contributed significantly to my success, but more importantly, his story served as a constant reminder of the importance of keeping academic achievement in proper perspective. After graduating from high school, I made arrangements with Yamamoto-sensei to establish a small memorial at Shinkojuku, honoring students who had struggled with academic pressure, including a dedication to Tanaka Hiroshi and his desire to help fellow students succeed. The memorial includes resources about stress management and mental health support, ensuring that future students will have access to the help that Tanaka-kun needed, but apparently didn't receive during his own preparation period. Looking back on my encounters with Tanaka-kun's spirit, I realized they taught me crucial lessons about the dangers of perfectionism and the importance of maintaining perspective during high-pressure academic periods. His supernatural assistance with my studies was valuable, but his tragic story provided an even more important lesson about the need to seek help when academic pressure becomes overwhelming. The third-floor study hall at Shinkojuku continues to serve students preparing for university entrance examinations, and the competitive atmosphere remains as intense as ever. But I hope that the memorial we established and the resources it provides will help future students understand that academic success should never come at the cost of physical and mental health, and that there are always people available to provide support during the most challenging periods of educational preparation. Even now, years later, when I encounter high school students struggling with academic pressure, I think of Tanaka-kun and try to provide the kind of encouragement and perspective that might help them achieve their goals while maintaining their well-being. His spirit's dedication to helping other students succeed represents the positive aspects of academic ambition, while his tragic death serves as a constant reminder of the importance of balance, support, and asking for help when the pressure becomes too much to handle alone. The moving truck. My name is Watanabe Keisuke, and I've been working as a professional mover for over 20 years, specializing in the difficult task of clearing out apartments where tenants have died under tragic circumstances. What I'm about to share happened during the winter of 2023, when my crew and I encountered supernatural phenomena that fundamentally changed my understanding of how deeply people can become attached to their possessions and living spaces, especially when social isolation has made their apartments the only remaining connection to normal human life. My company, Tokyo Clearout Services, contracts with landlords, family members, and municipal authorities to remove belongings and prepare Jiko-buken properties for renovation or re-rental after unnatural deaths have occurred. This specialized work requires not only physical labor, but also emotional resilience, as we often encounter scenes that reflect the final weeks or months of people who died alone, in poverty, or under circumstances that speak to profound human suffering. The job pays well, because few people are willing to do this type of work, and there's steady demand, as Tokyo's aging population and increasing social isolation create situations where people die unnoticed in their apartments for extended periods. My crew consists of 4 experienced workers who understand the sensitivity required when handling the personal belongings of deceased individuals and their families. The apartment that would become the source of our supernatural encounters was located on the 4th floor of a 6-story building in Edogawa Ward, in a neighborhood that housed primarily elderly residents and single people living on modest incomes. The building was constructed in the 1970s and showed signs of deferred maintenance, with narrow hallways, thin walls, and outdated fixtures that reflected its status as affordable housing for Tokyo's working class. We were hired by the building's management company to clear out apartment 406, where a 68-year-old man named Kojima Tetsuo had lived alone for over 15 years before dying of natural causes related to diabetes and heart disease. Kojima-san had been found by building management after neighbors complained about an unusual smell, and police estimated that he had been deceased for approximately 3 weeks before discovery. When we first entered the apartment to assess the scope of work required, I was struck by how carefully organized and maintained everything appeared despite the tragic circumstances. Kojima-san had clearly taken great pride in his living space, with books arranged precisely on shelves, clothing folded neatly in dresser drawers, and kitchen items stored in logical, accessible locations that reflected decades of solitary living routines. The apartment was small but efficiently organized, with every item serving a clear purpose and occupying a specific place that had been determined through years of careful consideration. There were signs of hobbies and interests, model trains, classical music records, and cooking equipment that suggested someone who had found ways to create meaning and pleasure within the confines of a solitary lifestyle. What made this job particularly challenging was that Kojima-san apparently had no living relatives willing or able to claim his belongings, which meant that everything would need to be disposed of according to municipal guidelines for unclaimed property. This always adds emotional weight to our work, as we're essentially dismantling someone's entire life with no family members present to identify items of sentimental value or personal significance. Our plan was to complete the apartment clearing over 3 days, sorting items into categories for donation, recycling, or disposal, while documenting valuable items that might be sold to offset the costs of clearing services. We began with the bedroom and bathroom areas, working systematically through closets and storage spaces before moving to the main living areas. On our first day, The work proceeded normally until late afternoon, when I noticed that items we had already packed and moved to our staging area near the apartment entrance were somehow back in their original locations. A collection of books that we had removed from bedroom shelves was neatly arranged exactly where we had found them, despite the fact that none of my crew members had any reason to unpack items we had already processed. Initially, I assumed this was simply a mistake in our workflow. Perhaps one of the newer crew members had become confused about which items had already been processed and had inadvertently returned things to their original positions. I reminded everyone to follow our standard procedures and to confirm with me before moving any items back into the apartment. However, the same thing happened on our second day of work. Items that we had carefully packed and loaded into our truck were mysteriously returned to their precise original locations in the apartment, arranged with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized Kojima-san's living space. Books were not only back on their shelves, but organized in the exact same order. Clothing was returned to specific dresser drawers, and kitchen items were placed in their designated cabinets with the careful precision of someone who had developed very specific organizational systems. When I questioned my crew members about these incidents, all three adamantly denied moving any items back into the apartment. They were as puzzled as I was about how packed belongings were reappearing in their original positions, especially since we had been working together as a team and would have noticed anyone unpacking items that had already been processed. On our third day, I decided to conduct a more systematic test of what was happening. I personally packed a specific collection of items, Kojima-san's model train collection, which had been displayed on a shelf in the main living area, and placed the sealed boxes in our truck, while my crew worked on other areas of the apartment. I then stationed myself where I could observe both the apartment and the truck to see if I could determine how the items were being moved. What I witnessed challenged my understanding of the physical world and introduced me to supernatural phenomena that I had never encountered during my 20 years of clearing out apartments where people had died. While watching the apartment, I saw the shadowy figure of an elderly man moving around the living space, carefully returning items to their designated locations with the methodical attention of someone who had spent years perfecting his organizational systems. The figure appeared to be Kojima-san himself, wearing the simple clothing that we had found in his dresser drawers, and moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had lived alone for many years and had developed very specific routines for maintaining his living space. He seemed completely focused on restoring his apartment to its proper condition, showing no awareness of our presence or our work. When I looked toward our truck, I could see that the boxes containing his model train collection were empty, though I was certain I had sealed them securely just minutes earlier. The trains themselves were back on their display shelf in the apartment, arranged in the exact same configuration we had found them, as if they had never been disturbed. This supernatural activity continued throughout our remaining time in the apartment, with increasing intensity as we attempted to remove more of Kojima-san's belongings. Every item we packed would somehow find its way back to its original location, restored with the careful precision that reflected his lifelong dedication to maintaining order and meaning in his solitary living space. The situation was affecting both our work schedule and my crew's morale. We were making no progress toward clearing the apartment, and the constant repetition of packing items only to find them returned to their original positions was creating frustration and unease among workers who had previously handled challenging situations with professional competence. I decided to seek guidance from Yoshida-san, an elderly Buddhist monk at a nearby temple who had experience helping families deal with spiritual disturbances related to death and attachment to material possessions. When I explained our situation, he listened thoughtfully before providing insights that helped me understand what we were encountering. Kojima-san lived alone for many years, and his possessions became his primary connection to structure, meaning, and identity, Yoshida-san explained. When someone dies in such isolation, their spirit can become trapped by attachment to the physical objects that represented their entire world. He cannot accept that his life has ended, because letting go of his belongings would mean accepting the complete dissolution of everything that gave his existence meaning. Yoshida-san taught me how to approach Kojima-san's spirit with respect, while helping him understand that his earthly attachments needed to be released. He provided specific prayers and offerings that would acknowledge Kojima-san's care for his possessions, while encouraging him to find peace in letting go of material concerns. Following Yoshida-san's guidance, I arranged for a small memorial service to be held in the apartment before we attempted any further packing. We set up a temporary altar with incense, flowers, and simple food offerings that honored Kojima-san's memory and acknowledged his decades of careful attention to his living space. During the memorial service, I spoke directly to Kojima-san's spirit, expressing respect for the life he had built in the apartment, and recognition of how much care he had put into organizing and maintaining his belongings. Kojima-san, I said aloud, we can see how much you love this apartment and how carefully you arranged everything here. You created a beautiful, organized home that reflects your good character and attention to detail. But now it's time for these belongings to help other people who need them. Your possessions will be treated with respect and will find new homes where they can continue to serve a useful purpose. I also explained our work process and assured him that valuable items would be donated to people who would appreciate them, while personal items of sentimental value would be handled with appropriate reverence. The memorial service had an immediate and noticeable effect on the supernatural activity in the apartment. When we resumed our packing work the following day, items stayed in the boxes where we placed them, and we were able to make steady progress toward completing the apartment clearing. However, the supernatural presence didn't disappear entirely. Instead, it seemed to take on a more collaborative character. Sometimes I would find that items had been pre-sorted or organized in ways that made our work easier, as if Kojima-san's spirit was helping us understand which belongings were most important or how they should be grouped for donation or disposal. During our final day in the apartment, I had what I believe was a direct farewell encounter with Kojima-san's spirit. While conducting a final walkthrough of the empty rooms, I saw him standing near the window where he had apparently spent many hours looking out at the neighborhood during his years of solitary living. When he noticed me watching him, he bowed deeply in the formal, respectful manner of someone expressing gratitude for careful attention to important duties. In that moment, I understood that he appreciated the respect we had shown for his belongings and the care we had taken to ensure that his possessions would continue to serve useful purposes rather than simply being discarded as waste. After that encounter, the supernatural activity stopped completely, and the apartment took on the empty, peaceful atmosphere, typical of cleared properties ready for renovation or new tenants. The experience of working in Kojima-san's apartment fundamentally changed my approach to clearing out properties where people have died alone. I began incorporating memorial services and respectful acknowledgement of deceased tenants into our standard procedures, understanding that these spiritual practices often help resolve supernatural disturbances while also providing emotional closure for our crew. I also started paying more attention to signs of social isolation among elderly clients and began connecting families with resources for elder care and social support services. Kojima-san's situation reminded me that many people in Tokyo are living in circumstances similar to his, with limited social connections and deep attachments to their possessions that may be their primary source of meaning and identity. Looking back on our supernatural encounters in that Edogawa apartment, I realize they taught me important lessons about the dignity that people maintain even in isolation, and the responsibility that comes with handling the belongings of those who have died alone. Kojima-san's spirit wasn't trying to prevent us from doing our job. He was protecting the life he had built within the confines of economic necessity and social circumstances that had limited his options for connection, community. The careful organization of his apartment and his supernatural attachment to his possessions reflected not hoarding or obsession, but rather the human need to create meaning and maintain dignity, even when life circumstances have reduced one's world to a single small living space. Even now, years later, when my crew and I encounter similar situations involving elderly people who have died alone, I remember Kojima-san and try to approach our work with the understanding that we're not just clearing out belongings, we're dismantling someone's entire universe and helping their spirit transition from earthly attachments to whatever comes after death. The apartment in Edogawa has been renovated and rented to new tenants who have no knowledge of its previous occupant or the supernatural activity that once made our work there so challenging. But I will always remember it as the place where I learned that professional moving services sometimes involve helping both the living and the dead let go of the possessions that anchor us to our earthly experiences and identities. The security guard. My name is Ogawa Hiroshi, and I've worked as a night security guard for over 12 years, primarily at corporate office buildings throughout Tokyo's business districts. What I'm about to share happened during my tenure at Prosperity Tower, a 30-story office complex in Minato Ward, where I encountered supernatural phenomena that fundamentally changed my understanding of how the past continues to influence the present, especially when modern developments are constructed on sites where multiple tragedies have occurred. I began working at Prosperity Tower in the spring of 2022, hired by the building management company to provide overnight security services for a structure that housed approximately 40 different businesses, ranging from small consulting firms to regional offices of major corporations. The building had been completed just 3 years earlier, representing the kind of modern, efficient office space that characterizes Tokyo's ongoing urban development and economic growth. My responsibilities included conducting hourly security rounds through all 30 floors, monitoring building access through electronic keycard systems, responding to after-hours emergencies, and ensuring that all building systems were functioning properly during the overnight hours when most tenants were absent. The work was generally routine and peaceful, involving long periods of quiet surveillance, punctuated by brief interactions with late-working employees or early morning cleaning staff. The building itself was impressive in its scale and modern design, with each floor containing approximately 6,000 square feet of office space, divided into individual suites that could be configured according to tenant needs. The layout was efficient and logical, with central elevator banks providing access to all floors and emergency stairwells positioned at opposite ends of each floor for safety compliance. During my first several months at Prosperity Tower, I established a routine that allowed me to complete my security rounds efficiently while maintaining the alertness necessary for identifying potential problems or security concerns. Most floors were completely empty during my overnight shifts, with only occasional late-working employees or cleaning crews providing any human activity during the quiet hours between midnight and 6 a.m. However, I began to notice unusual patterns of elevator activity during my third month on the job, particularly involving the elevator banks that served floors 10 through 20. During my rounds, I would frequently find that elevator cars had been called to specific floors despite no one being present to request service, and the call buttons would show that floors had been selected from inside the cars, even though they were empty when I investigated. The most persistent problems occurred with elevators serving the 14th floor, where tenant companies had reported various technical issues, including phantom button presses, cars stopping at the floor without being called, and occasional elevator doors opening and closing repeatedly without apparent cause. The building's elevator maintenance company had inspected the systems multiple times, but found no mechanical or electrical problems that could account for these irregularities. During my security rounds, I also began noticing other strange phenomena on the 14th floor that couldn't be explained through normal building operations. I would find wet footprints in the carpeted hallways, leading from the elevator banks to specific office suites, despite no evidence of water leaks, cleaning activity, or other sources of moisture that could account for the dampness. The footprints appeared to follow consistent paths from the elevators to particular office locations, as if invisible visitors were walking purposefully through the building toward specific destinations. The prints were always the size and shape of adult bare feet, and they would appear fresh and damp during my evening rounds, but would be completely gone by the following night. Most puzzling was the layout pattern that these wet footprints seemed to follow. Rather than moving toward actual office entrances or following the logical flow of the building's corridor design, the prints would lead to seemingly arbitrary locations in the middle of office suites, where they would simply stop without any indication of where the invisible walker had gone. During my 6th month at Prosperity Tower, I decided to research the history of the site where the building had been constructed, hoping to find some explanation for the unusual activity that might help building management address whatever was causing the elevator problems and other disturbances that were beginning to concern some of the tenant companies. What I discovered through municipal records and local newspaper archives provided disturbing context for the supernatural phenomena I had been experiencing. The site where Prosperity Tower now stood had previously been occupied by Sakura Heights, a residential apartment complex that had been demolished in 2019 to make way for the current commercial development. Sakura Heights had been constructed during the 1970s as affordable housing for working families, but during the economic recession of the early 1990s, the complex had become associated with a series of tragic suicides as residents faced unemployment, bankruptcy, and other financial pressures that overwhelmed their ability to cope with drastically changed economic circumstances. According to newspaper reports from that period, at least 7 residents of Sakura Heights had taken their own lives between 1991 and 1995, most by jumping from balconies or windows of their apartments. The cluster of suicides had created a stigma around the complex that made it increasingly difficult to rent units, leading to declining maintenance, rising crime, and eventual classification as a distressed property. The apartment complex had been demolished after sitting partially vacant for several years, with the site remaining undeveloped until the economic recovery of the late 2000s and teens made it attractive for commercial redevelopment. Prosperity Tower had been constructed using the exact footprint of the former apartment complex, though obviously with a completely different internal layout, optimized for office use rather than residential living. Understanding this history helped me recognize the pattern that the wet footprints were following on the 14th floor. When I compared the locations where the prints appeared with historical building plans for Sakura Heights that I found in municipal archives, I realized that the mysterious footprints were leading to spots that corresponded exactly to where apartment balconies had been located in the original residential building. The elevator activity also began to make sense when viewed through this historical lens. The 14th floor of Prosperity Tower corresponded to the 7th floor of the former Sakura Heights complex, which had been one of the floors where multiple suicides had occurred during the economic recession. The spirits of former residents seemed to be continuing their final journeys from their apartments to the balconies where they had ended their lives, following routes that no longer existed in the physical world but remained embedded in their spiritual memory. This realization transformed my perspective on the supernatural activity from mere curiosity to profound sympathy for people who had died in despair during one of Japan's most challenging economic periods. These were not malevolent spirits seeking to frighten or harm anyone, but rather souls trapped in the final moments of their earthly lives unable to understand that the apartments where they had lived and died no longer existed. I decided to seek guidance from Takeda-san, a Buddhist monk at a nearby temple who had experience helping families deal with spiritual disturbances related to urban development and the displacement of former residential areas. When I explained what I had been experiencing and the historical research I had conducted, he listened with understanding and provided valuable insights about how to address the situation respectfully. These spirits are lost in time, Takeda-san explained. They continue to follow the paths they took during their final moments because they cannot accept that their world has been completely erased and replaced. They need acknowledgement of their suffering and guidance to help them understand that their earthly concerns have ended. Following Takeda-san's recommendations, I arranged for a memorial service to be held on the 14th floor of Prosperity Tower, with the building management company's permission and participation. The service honored all the former residents of Sakura Heights who had died during the economic recession, acknowledging their struggles and providing spiritual support for their peaceful transition to whatever comes after death. We set up a temporary altar in the area that corresponded to the center of the former apartment complex, with offerings of flowers, incense, and simple foods that represented respect for people who had faced poverty and desperation during their final months of life. Takeda-san led prayers specifically designed to help earthbound spirits release their attachment to places and circumstances that had caused them suffering. During the memorial service, I could sense the presence of multiple spirits gathering in the office space, drawn by the acknowledgement of their pain and the respectful recognition of their tragic deaths. The atmosphere felt heavy with years of accumulated grief and unresolved despair, but also hopeful as these long-trapped souls finally received the spiritual attention they needed. The effects of the memorial service were immediate and profound. The elevator problems that had been plaguing the 14th floor stopped completely, with no more phantom button presses or unexplained mechanical behavior. The wet footprints that had appeared nightly in the hallways ceased entirely, and the general atmosphere of the floor felt lighter and more peaceful. Most importantly, several tenant companies reported improved working conditions on the 14th floor, with employees mentioning that they felt more comfortable and productive in spaces that had previously felt oppressive or unsettling for reasons they couldn't explain. However, the memorial service didn't completely eliminate all supernatural activity in Prosperity Tower. Instead, it transformed the nature of the spiritual presence from trapped suffering to protective watchfulness. Occasionally, during my security rounds, I would sense benevolent spirits accompanying me through the building, as if former residents were helping to ensure the safety and security of the current occupants. During my final year working at Prosperity Tower, I had what I believe was a direct encounter with one of the former Sakura Heights residents. While conducting a late-night security round on the 14th floor, I saw the translucent figure of a middle-aged man in business clothes standing near one of the windows that overlooked the city lights. When he noticed me watching him, instead of disappearing, he bowed respectfully and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from a great distance. "Thank you for remembering us. We can rest peacefully now, knowing that our suffering was acknowledged and that this place has become somewhere people can work and build better lives." After that encounter, the supernatural activity in Prosperity Tower became virtually undetectable, though I maintained the small memorial shrine that we had established and continued to offer occasional prayers for the peaceful rest of former residents who had died in despair on that site. The experience of working at Prosperity Tower taught me important lessons about the responsibility that comes with developing properties where people have lived and died under tragic circumstances. While economic development and urban renewal are necessary aspects of a growing city, they should be undertaken with awareness and respect for the human stories that preceded the new construction. I also learned about the importance of acknowledging historical trauma and providing spiritual closure for communities that have been displaced by redevelopment. The memorial service we held for the former residents of Sakura Heights represented a small but meaningful gesture of recognition for people whose struggles and deaths might otherwise have been forgotten in the rush toward modernization and economic progress. Looking back on my time at Prosperity Tower, I realized that my role as a security guard involved protecting not only the current occupants and their property, but also honoring the memory of former residents whose spiritual presence remained connected to the site where they had experienced their greatest challenges and final moments. The building continues to serve as successful commercial space housing, thriving businesses, and providing employment for hundreds of people who work there during daytime hours. But I will always remember it as a place where I learned that urban development should include spiritual as well as physical considerations, and that acknowledging the past can help create more peaceful and harmonious environments for future generations. Even now, working at a different building, I maintain awareness of the historical context of the sites where I provide security services, understanding that my job involves more than protecting physical property. I'm also serving as a guardian for the accumulated human experiences that make every location in Tokyo a repository of countless individual stories of struggle, hope, success, and loss. The memorial shrine on the 14th floor of Prosperity Tower remains as a quiet reminder that modern commercial success can coexist respectfully with acknowledgement of past tragedy, and that providing spiritual closure for historical trauma is an important aspect of creating truly sustainable urban communities.
Expenses that had to be factored into pricing strategies. The innovation that characterized Al's approach to criminal organization extended beyond mere operational efficiency to encompass marketing strategies that would have impressed legitimate business executives. The branding of different alcoholic products with distinctive labels and consistent quality standards helped establish customer loyalty and commanded premium prices from speakeasy operators who understood that their clientele would pay extra for reliable products. The development of these marketing approaches reflected Al's recognition that criminal enterprise, like legitimate business, ultimately depended on customer satisfaction and repeat sales. The security measures that protected the brewing operations from both law enforcement and criminal competitors required constant vigilance and substantial financial investment. The guards who protected warehouse facilities carried weapons that reflected the serious nature of the threats they faced, while the communication systems that coordinated security responses employed the latest technological innovations available to criminal organizations with sufficient resources to purchase sophisticated equipment. The diplomatic relationships that Al cultivated with other criminal organizations throughout the Midwest reflected his understanding that sustainable success required cooperation as well as competition. The agreements that divided territorial markets and coordinated responses to law enforcement pressure created a framework for criminal collaboration that resembled the trade associations and industry cooperatives that facilitated legitimate business relationships. As autumn approached, and the bootlegging empire that Al had constructed during the spring and summer months prepared for its first full operational cycle, the organization had evolved into something that resembled a legitimate corporation more closely than the street gangs that had characterized criminal enterprise in earlier eras. The employees who depended on the organization for their livelihoods numbered in the hundreds, while the customers who relied on its products included some of Chicago's most prominent citizens and influential institutions. The warehouse that had begun as an abandoned industrial facility had been transformed into the nerve center of an operation that generated revenue comparable to major legitimate corporations. The sounds that filled the building during operational periods reflected the complex coordination required to manage large-scale criminal enterprise. The mechanical noises of brewing equipment, the conversations of workers and supervisors, the telephone calls that coordinated deliveries and collections, and the constant flow of vehicles that connected the central facility to the network of speakeasies and other customers that provided the market for its products. The success that Al had achieved in building this criminal corporation during his first full year of operations in Chicago established patterns and relationships that would influence the development of organized crime throughout the Prohibition era. The organizational innovations and management techniques that he had developed would be adopted by criminal groups throughout the country, while the territorial arrangements and political alliances that protected his operations would serve as models for similar enterprises in other American cities. The young man who had arrived in Chicago as Johnny Torrio's protege had become the architect of a criminal empire that would soon require even more sophisticated organizational structures and strategic vision to manage the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The fog that rolled in from Lake Michigan on the evening of October 15th, 1922, carried with it more than the usual chill of autumn. As the mist settled over Chicago's north side, it seemed to muffle not only the sounds of the city, but also the tensions that had been building between competing criminal organizations throughout the bootlegging season. In his suite at the Lexington Hotel, Alphonse Capone stood at the window overlooking the darkening streets, contemplating the strategic challenges that threatened to disrupt the carefully constructed empire he had spent 2 years building. The territorial disputes that had emerged during the summer months reflected the inevitable conflicts that arose when multiple criminal organizations competed for control of Chicago's lucrative bootlegging markets. The North Side Gang, led by the ambitious and unpredictable Dion O'Banion, had begun encroaching on territories that Al considered essential to his organization's continued expansion. These violations of established boundaries were not merely matters of criminal pride, but represented threats to revenue streams that supported hundreds of employees and dozens of business operations.
That booth would occasionally report technical problems that our IT support staff couldn't reproduce or explain. The most frequent complaint was that text would appear on the screen that the customer hadn't typed, always the same message: "Please, don't let me die alone." This text would appear in various applications, word processors, email programs, chat windows, and sometimes even overlaying other content on the screen. Customers would call for technical support, but by the time I arrived at booth 7, the mysterious text would be gone and the computer would be functioning normally. During my 6th month at Cyberzone, these technical anomalies became more frequent and more disturbing. In addition to the text messages, customers reported that the computer in booth 7 would sometimes display websites they hadn't visited, typically job search sites or social services pages related to mental health support and homeless assistance programs. More concerning was the pattern I noticed in our customer management system regarding booth 7. Despite Matsuda-san's death and the cancellation of his membership account, the system would occasionally show renewed membership payments credited to his name, even though his credit card had been canceled months earlier, and no one else could be making payments on his behalf. When I brought these billing irregularities to Nakamura-san's attention, he was as puzzled as I was. The payment processing system showed valid transactions, but the credit card numbers associated with the payments belonged to accounts that were no longer active. The payments appeared to be genuine, but there was no logical explanation for how they were being processed. During my 7th month working at Cyberzone, I had my first direct encounter with what I believe was Matsuda, sans continuing presence in Booth 7. While conducting my regular rounds to check on customers and ensure everything was functioning properly, I noticed that Booth 7 appeared to be occupied despite no one being checked in to use that computer. When I looked through the small window in the booth door, I could see someone sitting at the computer, typing steadily with the focused concentration of someone working on important correspondence. The figure appeared to be Matsuda-san, wearing the same casual clothing I remembered from his regular visits, bent over the keyboard with the same posture he had maintained during his hours of job searching. When I knocked on the booth door to check if everything was all right, there was no response. When I used my master key to open the door, the booth was empty, though the computer screen showed a job application form partially completed with Matsuda-san's personal information. This pattern of supernatural activity continued throughout the remaining months of my employment at Cyberzone. Customers would report seeing someone in Booth 7 during hours when it wasn't officially occupied, and I would occasionally encounter evidence of Matsuda-san's continuing attempts to find employment and stable housing despite his death. The job applications that appeared on the computer in Booth 7 were always meticulously completed, showing the same attention to detail and professional presentation that had characterized Matsuda-san's approach to his job search during his lifetime. The applications were for entry-level positions that would have been appropriate for someone trying to rebuild their career after a period of unemployment, and they consistently emphasized his willingness to work hard and his gratitude for any opportunity to prove himself. I began to understand that Matsuda-san's spirit was trapped in the same cycle of hope and desperation that had defined his final months of life. He continued to search for employment and housing opportunities, unable to accept that his earthly struggles had ended and that he no longer needed to worry about survival and economic security. The supernatural presence wasn't malevolent or frightening, quite the opposite. It represented the continuing determination of someone who had never stopped trying to improve his situation, even when facing overwhelming obstacles and social isolation. His ghostly job searching reflected the dignity and perseverance he had maintained, despite the circumstances that had led to his tragic death. I decided to seek guidance from Suzuki-san, a social worker who provided outreach services for homeless individuals and who had occasionally visited Cyberzone to connect with people who might need assistance with housing, employment, or mental health support. When I carefully explained what I had been experiencing, she listened with understanding and provided important perspective on both the supernatural encounters and the underlying social issues they represented. Matsuda-san's spirit is still trying to find the stability and acceptance that eluded him during his final months, she explained. Internet cafes become home for people who have nowhere else to go, and the computers represent their last connection to hope for a better future. He's probably still trying to achieve the goals that gave meaning to his life when everything else had been taken away. Suzuki-san helped me understand that the best way to help Matsuda-san's spirit find peace was to acknowledge his continuing efforts, while also providing the recognition and acceptance that he had needed during his current lifetime. She suggested creating a memorial that honored his determination and perseverance, while offering prayers for his successful transition to whatever comes after death. Following her guidance, I arranged for a small memorial service to be held at Cyberzone during our overnight hours. With Nakamura-san's permission and participation, we set up a temporary altar near Booth 7, with offerings of flowers, incense, and simple foods, along with printed copies of job applications and housing information that represented Matsuda-san's continuing search for stability and acceptance. During the memorial service, I spoke directly to Matsuda-san's spirit, acknowledging his hard work and expressing regret that he hadn't received the help and support he needed during his most difficult period. Matsuda-san, I said aloud, I see how hard you've been working to find a job and a place to live. You've shown incredible determination and dignity even during the most challenging circumstances. You don't need to keep searching anymore. You've done enough. And you deserve to rest peacefully now. I also promised that Cyberzone would continue to serve as a safe space for people experiencing homelessness and social isolation, ensuring that other individuals in similar situations would receive the support and recognition that Matsuda-san had needed, but perhaps hadn't found during his lifetime. The memorial service had an immediate and noticeable effect on the supernatural activity in Booth 7. The mysterious text messages and phantom job applications stopped appearing, and customers no longer reported seeing someone using the computer during unoccupied hours. The booth returned to normal operation, serving customers without any unexplained technical problems. However, the experience fundamentally changed my approach to my work at Cyberzone and my understanding of the important role that Internet cafes play in providing basic services for Tokyo's most vulnerable residents. I began paying more attention to customers who seemed to be using the facility as temporary shelter, and I learned to recognize signs of homelessness, depression, and social isolation that might indicate someone needed additional support. I also started connecting isolated customers with social service resources, providing information about mental health support, housing assistance, and employment programs that might help them address the underlying problems that had brought them to rely on commercial establishments for basic needs, like shelter and internet access. Looking back on my supernatural encounters with Matsuda-san's spirit, I realized they taught me crucial lessons about the dignity that people maintain even in desperate circumstances, and the importance of recognizing the humanity of individuals who have become invisible to mainstream society due to homelessness, unemployment, or other forms of social exclusion. Matsuda-san's continuing job search after death represented not just spiritual attachment to earthly concerns, but also his fundamental desire for acceptance, purpose, and inclusion in a society that had failed to provide him with adequate support during his most vulnerable period. The Booth 7 at Cyberzone continues to serve customers who need internet access during overnight hours, and the facility remains an important resource for people who have limited options for shelter, communication, and job searching. But I will always remember it as the place where I learned that customer service work sometimes involves providing not just technical support, but also human recognition and dignity for people whose struggles may not be visible to casual observers. Even now, working at a different job, I maintain awareness of signs that someone might be experiencing homelessness or social isolation, and I try to provide the kind of respectful acknowledgement and resource information that might help prevent others from reaching the level of desperation that led to Matsuda-san's tragic death. The supernatural activity in Booth 7 served as a powerful reminder that behind every customer transaction is a real person with hopes, struggles, and a fundamental need for acceptance and support that extends beyond simple commercial relationships. The apartment viewing. My name is Sato Hiroshi, and I've worked as a real estate agent for over 8 years, specializing in affordable housing for families facing financial difficulties in Tokyo's competitive rental market. What I'm about to share happened during my work, showing a particular apartment in Kita Ward throughout the autumn and winter of 2023, when I encountered supernatural phenomena that fundamentally changed my understanding of how economic desperation can create spiritual attachments that persist beyond death. My specialty within the real estate industry focuses on properties that other agents find difficult to market. Jikobuken apartments, where unnatural deaths have occurred, units with structural issues or outdated amenities, and buildings in less desirable neighborhoods that appeal primarily to tenants with limited financial options. This niche requires not only professional expertise, but also sensitivity to the circumstances that drive families to accept housing with challenging histories or conditions. The work is emotionally demanding but financially rewarding, as property owners are often willing to offer generous commissions to agents who can successfully rent units that have been sitting vacant due to stigma or other marketability issues. My client base consists primarily of working families, single parents, recent immigrants, and young people who need affordable housing but lack the financial resources to be selective about location or property history. The apartment that would become the center of my supernatural experiences was located on the third floor of a four-story building in Kita Ward, in a residential neighborhood that housed primarily working-class families and elderly residents living on fixed incomes. The unit was a modest two-bedroom apartment with basic amenities, priced significantly below market rate due to its classification as a Jiko Buken property, where the previous tenant had died by suicide. According to the disclosure documentation required by law, the previous tenant, Yamamoto Kenji, had been a 42-year-old office worker who had lost his job during corporate restructuring and had been unable to find new employment despite months of intensive job searching. He had been found deceased in the apartment by building management after neighbors reported an unusual smell, and police determined that he had taken his own life using prescription medications. The circumstances of Yamamoto-san's death were particularly tragic because they reflected the broader economic pressures facing middle-aged workers who lose their jobs and struggle to find new employment in Japan's competitive job market. According to neighbors I spoke with, he had spent his final months conducting job searches from his apartment, rarely leaving except for interviews or to purchase necessities. My responsibility was to show this apartment to prospective tenants while providing the required disclosure about its history, helping families understand both the potential benefits of reduced rent and the emotional considerations involved in living in a space where someone had died under tragic circumstances. Most viewers were families dealing with their own financial pressures who needed affordable housing, regardless of its unfortunate history. During my first few showings of Yamamoto-san's former apartment, I noticed some unusual aspects of the property that hadn't been mentioned in the building documentation. The second bedroom, which appeared to have been used as a home office, contained a desk position near the window that showed signs of intensive use, worn spots on the surface, multiple electrical outlets that had been added for computer equipment, and cable routing that suggested a sophisticated computer setup. More intriguingly, despite the apartment having been cleaned and cleared of all personal belongings months earlier, I would occasionally find printed documents on the floor of this room when I arrived for scheduled viewings. These papers were always job-related materials, resumes, cover letters, and application forms that appeared to be recently printed despite no printer being present in the empty apartment. The resumes were professionally formatted and detailed, showing extensive work experience in office administration and customer service, along with additional skills training that suggested someone who had been working hard to make himself more employable during a difficult job market. The documents were always dated with current dates, as if someone was continuously updating and improving their job application materials. During my third month showing the apartment, prospective tenants began reporting unusual sounds during viewings, particularly coming from the second bedroom that had served as Yamamoto-san's home office. Families would mention hearing what sounded like typing on a computer keyboard, even though the room was completely empty of furniture or equipment. The typing sounds would typically begin about 10 minutes into a viewing and continue intermittently throughout the remainder of the apartment tour. The rhythm and intensity suggested someone working diligently on important documents, with occasional pauses that might indicate reviewing text or searching for the right words to express something significant. These auditory phenomena made some prospective tenants uncomfortable, especially when I was required to explain that the sounds were coming from the room where the previous tenant had spent his final weeks searching for employment that would never materialize. However, other families were less concerned about supernatural activity and more focused on the practical benefits of affordable rent in a decent neighborhood. During my fourth month marketing the apartment, the supernatural manifestations became more frequent and more detailed. In addition to finding printed resumes and hearing typing sounds, I began discovering other job search materials scattered around the empty apartment, printouts of job listings, company research documents, and interview preparation notes that showed the methodical approach of someone who had been treating his job search as a full-time occupation. The materials were always current and relevant to the contemporary job market, suggesting that Yamamoto-san's spirit was somehow continuing his employment search with access to up-to-date information about available positions and hiring trends. The quality of the documents was consistently high, showing the attention to detail and professional presentation skills of someone who understood how to market himself effectively to potential employers. Most remarkable was the progression of the documents over time. Early resumes, I found, were formatted in traditional, conservative styles appropriate for established companies, but later versions showed adaptations to more modern presentation formats and included skills training that reflected current industry demands. It appeared that Yamamoto-san's spirit was learning and evolving his job search strategy even after death. I decided to research Yamamoto-san's background more thoroughly, hoping to understand both his professional history and the circumstances that had led to his tragic death. Through online memorial sites and former colleagues who had posted remembrances, I learned that he had been a reliable employee who had genuinely enjoyed his work and had been devastated by the corporate downsizing that had ended his 20-year career. Former co-workers described him as someone who had taken great pride in his professional competence and who had maintained his dignity and work ethic even during the increasingly desperate months of unemployment. His job search had been systematic and persistent, showing the same attention to detail that had characterized his approach to his regular employment. The tragedy of his situation was that he had been highly qualified and experienced, but the combination of his age, the competitive job market, and the economic disruption caused by corporate restructuring had created circumstances where even talented workers could face extended periods of unemployment that eventually became overwhelming. Understanding this background helped me recognize that the supernatural activity in the apartment represented Yamamoto-san's continuing dedication to the work ethic and professional goals that had defined his adult life. His spirit seemed unable to accept that his career concerns had ended, and he continued the job search that had consumed his final months with the same systematic approach he had used while living. I consulted with Moriyama-san, a Buddhist monk at a nearby temple who had experience helping families deal with spiritual disturbances in rental properties, particularly those involving people who had died while struggling with unemployment or financial stress. When I explained the situation, he provided valuable insights about how to address Yamamoto-san's continuing presence respectfully. This man's spirit is trapped by his inability to complete his most important work, Moriyama-san explained. His job search represented not just economic necessity, but his sense of purpose, dignity, and social contribution. He cannot rest peacefully until he feels that his professional worth has been recognized and his efforts have achieved their intended goal. Moriyama-san suggested that the most effective way to help Yamamoto-san find peace would be to acknowledge his professional competence and provide the recognition that the job market had failed to give him during his final months. This could be accomplished through a memorial service that honored his work ethic and dedication while helping his spirit understand that his earthly obligations had been fulfilled. Following Moriyama-san's guidance, I arranged for a small memorial ceremony to be held in the apartment, with permission from the property owner and participation from some of Yamamoto-san's former colleagues who wanted to pay their respects to someone they remembered as a valued team member and friend. We set up a temporary altar in the room that had served as his home office, with offerings that reflected his professional life, flowers arranged in the formal style appropriate for corporate settings, incense, and printed copies of recommendation letters from former supervisors that emphasized his reliability, skill, and positive contributions to his workplace. During the memorial service, I spoke directly to Yamamoto, San's spirit, acknowledging his professional accomplishments and expressing regret that the economic circumstances of his job search had not reflected his true value as an employee and colleague. Yamamoto-san, I said aloud, your former coworkers remember you as someone who always did excellent work and who could be counted on to complete any assignment with care and attention to detail. Your professional skills and dedication were valuable, and your inability to find new employment was not a reflection of your worth as a worker or as a person. I also assured him that his continued job search efforts after death demonstrated the same persistence and professionalism that had characterized his approach to work throughout his career, and that these qualities would be remembered and honored even though his earthly employment concerns had ended. The memorial service had an immediate and profound effect on the supernatural activity in the apartment. The typing sounds that had been heard during viewings stopped completely, and no more job search documents appeared on the floor of the empty rooms. The apartment felt different, lighter, and more peaceful, as if a burden that had been weighing on the space for months had finally been lifted. However, the experience fundamentally changed my approach to marketing Jikobuken properties and working with families who were forced to consider housing with tragic histories due to economic necessity. I began incorporating information about the previous tenants' circumstances and characters into my presentations, helping prospective tenants understand that the supernatural activity they might encounter often reflected the continuing humanity of people who had faced overwhelming challenges. I also started connecting families with social service resources that could provide support during their own periods of financial difficulty, understanding that the economic pressures that had led to Yamamoto-san's tragedy were not unique, and that many of my clients might benefit from assistance with employment, mental health support, or financial counseling. The apartment in Kita Ward was eventually rented to a young family who understood its history and felt comfortable living there after learning about the memorial service and the respectful resolution of Yamamoto-san's spiritual presence. They have reported no supernatural disturbances and have found it to be a peaceful, affordable home that has allowed them to achieve financial stability during their own period of economic challenge. Looking back on my encounters with Yamamoto-san's spirit, I realized they taught me important lessons about the dignity that people maintain even during their most desperate circumstances, and the professional identity that can become so central to someone's sense of self that it persists. Beyond death, his continuing job search after death was not just spiritual attachment to earthly concerns, but also a reflection of the work ethic and sense of purpose that had given meaning to his life even when economic circumstances had made it impossible for him to continue contributing in the ways he valued most. The supernatural activity in that apartment served as a reminder that behind every Jikobuken property is a real person who lived, worked, hoped, and struggled in ways that deserve recognition and respect. My role as a real estate agent involves not just finding housing for current tenants, but also honoring the memory of previous residents whose stories become part of the property's continuing history. Even now, years later, when I show apartments with tragic histories, I try to share what I know about the previous tenants' lives and circumstances, helping prospective renters understand that they are not just accepting discounted housing, but also becoming stewards of spaces where real people faced some of life's most difficult challenges with whatever dignity and perseverance they could maintain.